Hello and welcome back to the Game Dev Show. Today we've got Yorai, Powell, and Greg, and we've got some interesting topics. We actually have somewhat of a schedule and some things to talk about today. So we're going to be getting into, it looks like some new announcements from Epic, some stuff that's going on with the Unity Asset Store. It's kind of interesting, not just sales. And more importantly, I want to talk about lighting and modding and getting assets into your game quickly for quick turnaround with artists and other things, or even allowing players to quickly and easily kind of change this stuff out. I feel like we'll get kind of deep into these discussions. So welcome. Thanks for joining us, everybody. How y'all doing today?
Pretty good. Well.
Doing well.
Good. It's good to see y'all here. Sorry, I forgot to cue the show up in advance, so we'll just have to go now. So I guess first off, before we get too deep into it, we were talking about the asset store, and recently, as of today, I think like 20 minutes ago, I found out that there's a new layout and design for the asset store that some people have and some people don't. I am not in the boat of seeing the new asset store version. For everybody who's here with us in chat, can you tell us if you see the new one or the old one? And what are y'all? Okay, so you're seeing the old one, right? There's the new sale that they've got if anybody needs a link to go check it out. But what are y'all's thoughts on this new one? So far, I've heard a bunch of people complain, not in this group, but in another call just a little while ago, about the new layout not being quite as nice.
Yeah, so I actually have it open on another tab here. And
are you able to screen share it? I can't get it to. I can't show it.
Let me try. Kind of wish we did that beforehand, but let's see. Share screen, and can I share?
Some people seeing the old one. Yeah, I see just the old one, but yeah, this new one.
Okay, are you able to see it?
Yes, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah. So basically, the UI changed so that categories are now on the left. We have different sorting categories. Popularity is gone.
Are the categories not a tree anymore either? Like checkbox tree like they were?
It seems collapsed, and I'm afraid to click the buttons. But so right now, let's focus on this.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only... It's like folders. You have to go in. You can't select which one you want.
Oh, okay.
The menu items count is down significantly, so you could have previously far more assets here, and also it's only 3 per line now. So
even if you make it much wider, if you stretch your screen out wide,
even in full width, it's just 3 items.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, very weird. It seems mobilized, if nothing else.
That is definitely not where I would ever look for assets on mobile.
Now, if I try to click on that, you do see the categories opening up, but everything else is gone. So you have to click a lot more to move between categories.
Oh, yeah, no more checkbox. I wonder if it's a bug.
I have no idea.
A work in progress. It's just not done yet.
Absolutely no idea.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah. Basically the change that's happening here. There is also another change that I can't show right now because I don't have the tab open. But the previous Unity versions catalog has changed. So now you can see a lot of stuff condensed together, and they actually changed the downloads list for all the previous Unity versions. One notable link that is gone is the Unity built-in shaders package. So there used to be a zip file that contained all the source code of the built-in Unity shaders, which only matters if you're using built-in, but now that's gone. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it sounds like the link just needs to get re-added. How's the new builds list look, though? Is it actually useful?
Yeah, I would say it's actually useful. I'm gonna stop sharing here, but let's see if I can find you the link. I should have this somewhere here. Download archive. Yeah, there we go. Okay, I found it pretty quickly. That's good. 1 second. I sent you the link. You should be able to see.
That looks much nicer.
Yeah.
It's got every build with release notes. That's actually perfect, yeah.
Yeah, and you can actually click the releases, and it shows release notes since the last version, and separately the if you scroll down, changes since the last major version, which is always great. So if you're
So
like 6.05, you can.
your audio is cutting out a little, Uri.
Oh, I'm sorry. So if you are on Unity 6.0.5 and you scroll down, you'll see changes from 0.4 and then separately changes since just starting this Unity version, which is a gigantic list. Like you'll start scrolling down and suddenly the scrolling will go way more. Oh, it's not doing that for you. Okay. Unity.
Huh. Interesting. I do like this page, so being able to actually see the different versions and have a quick hub install button for them, that is very nice. So yeah, hopefully whatever's going on in the asset layout gets fixed up too and be nice and clean. Anyway, there were a couple other things I wanted to talk about, obviously. I think more exciting than the asset store, although I do think that we should mention since Powell's asset is on the asset store sale, that there is a $35 sale going on right now. And you've got at least one thing in there, right? What was the asset?
The new Lava assets from 2023. Yeah. The same. It has the same API that the RAM asset that will be releasing day after tomorrow. Yeah, on Monday is the same technology that we use.
And that Monday is the RAM. Is it RAM 3 or is it RAM 2024? What's the name?
We are naming it RAM 3 and Lava will be renamed Lava 2023 will be renamed to Lava 3.
Oh, okay. You call them, just go with the version numbers and go away from the numbering too. I think I generally prefer that. And I mean, Unity's going away from that too, but I think that I've never been a big fan of year-based versioning unless it was something that was like continually getting releases and needed to get continual like annual releases, which almost nothing does, I feel like. I don't know how you all feel about that.
I would say annual releases make it far easier to find like what is actually the newest version as opposed to arbitrary naming, which is in hindsight something that sounds silly because you know that like bigger number, better version. But I have a problem with a lot of like major versions, which is you can't exactly tell how much has changed without them, and you shouldn't really want to know like, oh, this is a major version, unless you are actively trying to upgrade a project if you are switching between major versions, the one thing that will break is literally everything that already exists. So you only care about major versions when you are actually trying to move a project into a new version. If you are saying, I'm using the 2023 version of an engine with the 2023 version of an asset, this should be a safe set of things. If you're using Unity 6 and RAM free and I don't know, asset number 5.17, you don't know what is compatible. Mm-hmm. So I prefer yearly based versioning myself. Now, I understand that it makes it far harder to find new major shiny toys, which is exactly why Unreal is going with Unreal 5, whereas Unity went with yearly changes, and it was difficult to find anything meaningful. And I was switching back to that, but I prefer the yearly format because I really think.
Yeah, but with the yearly format, I think you kind of called out one of the downsides, which is that it's really hard to know when it's breaking changes and where those breaking changes are, and a lot of them just kind of get like shoved in, like there's minor breaking changes along the way instead of just like this hard break point of like you went from Unreal 2 to Unreal 3 or 3 to 4. You're like, okay, we're going to have to rework our characters, we're going to have to redo a lot of stuff and expect it, but we're also going to see a significant increase in fidelity and performance and just capabilities each time.
So the thing I have to counter for that is, first off, minor version changes should have a no break promise.
They should, but when you have yearly versioning, I've never seen that be the truth.
Yeah, but that's more like a problem with the company that decided to use that versioning rather than not. Like, you can wait a year; it's not the end of the world to try and push a set of updates, make them meaningful every year, instead of like, oh, here is a minor 0.0.1 version that changes the shaders, so all the assets break.
Oh, so hold on a second. Maybe I think I might have misunderstood your argument there. So you're saying that with the yearly builds, you're good with those having breaking changes in between. Oh, okay. I was thinking that you're saying no breaking changes even in between those. Okay.
No.
Okay. So the yearly build is like every year we can possibly have breaking changes.
Yes, but
in that case, yes. I mean, I can understand that, but it also makes it much harder to deal with upgrading long term, right? Because it means that when you're on 2020 and you're working through 2024, if you're upgrading along, you don't like every point along the way. There's possible breaking stuff and possible pain points versus just going like, hey, we're all the way up to the end of the life cycle of 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever, and now there's breaking change. When they come so really, really fast, it just makes it harder to upgrade, I guess. But
okay, so here is an important piece of this argument then. When you start working on a project, you usually lock your version down because you don't want to just kerfuffle with upgrading an engine version if there is no value in it. You already decided, okay, this is the tech stack, we are using it. If you are upgrading an engine version, you are also potentially upgrading minimum specs. Who knows if the engine dropped like something that you were counting on, hey, I'm going to run on this device, and now the engine doesn't support it anymore because it deemed it too old. The idea is that you lock down, and if you decide to make an upgrade, it's a conscious decision, and you're moving a major version, regardless if it's Unity 4 to Unity 5 or Unity 2017 to Unity 2024. So it shouldn't matter. The one thing that does come out of this is if everything uses a yearly format, then you know that everything is compatible with each other. If you have an asset that was using the 2020 version and now you are trying to upgrade to 2024, but you don't see a 2024 version of it, then you know it's potentially incompatible. But if it's asset version 2 and not asset version 3, you'd have no idea.
Yeah, unless again you're like Unity and you have 20 something dot something dot something, and each one can possibly break stuff anyway. So
yeah, but that's a problem on their credibility, accountability, whatever you want to call it. That's not a problem with.
No, I will say.
For me, the biggest problem with yearly releases is how long do you support them? That is the main question for me as a tool maker. Yeah, how long do you support 2024 version? If you have to support it for 3 years, you have 2021 version, you have 2022 version, 2023 version, 2024 version, you still have to support. And your programmer has to remember what was in 2021 version and what he can't add because it will break, what he can do in 2022 and so on. So your programs have to remember each version and what's working there and what's not working there. The amount of support you're getting from version that you have each year is quite problematic. I know it. I will try to do it. There's no chance. Yeah.
So
amount of support
is a different use case, right? This is a different user than the game developer.
You're actually talking about as an asset developer, which with all those
as asset as tools
tool developer, right?
The same.
Okay,
if you have to support each version and you have to remember what each version has, each version after 2 years will have different code. It will. There's no chance you would be supporting and doing exactly the same in its exact version.
But you are only talking about a case that would be viable to talk about if your same package of code has to run on multiple engine versions. This is the only case where you need it.
Because
you have a single project and you're upgrading
somebody
it,
finds a bug. No, you have each year releases. Somebody finds a bug in your 2-year-old release.
Yeah,
It's
not, and you have to support that. If it's still,
but in the game, you generally don't have to, right? So that's the thing. Like, if you're not doing
but in a game engine, if somebody starts building a game in 2021, and And you're saying that 2021 to 2022 can break everything, yeah, because it's different engine versions. And some big company makes a game in 2021 version. They will make the game for 4-5 years. So you have to support that version of engine for 5 years of different kinds of computers, different kinds of iOSs, Androids, etc. You have to support that version, and you have to support each different engine version for this amount of time.
But the game developers don't care, right? The game
Okay. I get the argument. You're saying that if I am a game developer, I am stuck with the engine version for 4 or 5 years. If I, 2 years into development, find a bug, how long is the company required to support me in fixing that bug for the version that I have locked onto?
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect argument. However, I'm completely numb to it because I'm working with XNA.
Yeah.
They're not going to help at all, right?
Yeah, XNA is dead. Nothing matters.
Yeah, but that's the same problem with me, with asset store sellers, with everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Assets for engine, it can be a problem. For asset store sellers, when you are 2-3 people working, and you have to remember each version, what kind of code it had, what changed, what you added, what you didn't add. It's getting a lot of troubles, and it's worse for the users.
Sure. However, those versions do have long-term support for a dedicated amount of time. Unity has decided that it's like, 2-3 years? I don't remember. And on that note, it's reasonable to say, okay, you knew that this version wouldn't have more than 3 years of support if you started, try to finish your project within 4 years, or else deal with whatever is there. We can't keep supporting you forever. That's a reasonable thing to say as a company.
But 4 years makes you 4 different versions, 4 different amounts of code, and different APIs, everything, yeah? Because each year you can change.
Yeah, but
each year it can be different.
Yeah, but what you're talking about essentially boils down to company skill issue. How a company decides to support it, they can have dedicated developers for the old version just to fix the bugs. It's possible if
I think it's more than that. Personally, I hate year-based. I absolutely despise it. I think it's a stupid practice. I hate it, but for very different reasons than anybody mentioned here, which is very funny. Though I will say something that Paul said does tie in, which is the implication that yearly literally means a new SKU of product for each year, when a numeric-based one means you can decide when a product gets upgraded to a new phase. It lets you decide how many SKUs of your product you have. But that's not why I hate it. Funnily enough, the reason I hate it, no one's mentioned yet. The reason I hate it is because humans in general are time blind, and we're really biased to the concept of our own experience, which means if you name a product based on a year, people are going to assume it's good or bad relative to the year differential between now and when it was made. And on top of that, they're going to bias versions based on their own perception of how a year went. It sounds stupid, but people are going to like or dislike a version of a year based on, oh, that's version 3 years ago, that must be outdated, because their perception of time is going to be relative to what the product is, not relative to what's important in the code. We know this from anything that changes. Whenever you look at something and you look at a date that's older than a few years, your assumption is it's old or bad. And so the problem with naming stuff based on years is people are going to presume that old equals bad relative to that, when if you have numeric versions, it's just the product. The product is what the product is. It is not bound to a concept in time that relates to where tech was or what things looked like. It's just a standalone thing. And you can use, as someone mentioned in the chat, all those arguments regarding breaking versions or not, that's what semantic versioning is meant to solve. That's the whole point of it. So from my perspective, it's down to there should be a SKU of a product. The product works. It's semantic versions. If you understand semantic version, you can pick the version that matches, whether you're willing to accept breaking changes or not. And when the company feels like they've made enough small feature changes, they can upgrade the version, possibly increase their licensing as they go, and maybe the pricing as well. And it's a very clear-cut structural system. Everyone knows what's going on. To me, annual brings in so many problems, and mostly to do with perception as well as the actual stuff you guys mentioned.
Sure, but it all boils down to how many things are you consuming together, and whether you can ignore perception bias, I guess, at this point.
You can't, though. That's the problem. You cannot ignore how people perceive things. And the fact is, that's annual is going to get you in a lot of trouble just by the way people perceive it.
Sure. I mean, if that's what we're going by, then fine.
Well, not to
I
mention
mean,
just the sheer confusion. Like, how many people have confusion going, we're in X year, but we're using version from year ... -2 or 3 or whatever. Like, how confusing is it having that conversation? Imagine talking to somebody and saying, what version of Unity are you on? 2, 3, 4, or 5. Instead, it's like, oh, I'm on 2022.3.5. Like, even the conversation when you get a new project or you join someone else's. As a consultant, the amount of projects I join, and it's a bit of a, we're trying to figure out which version. And then you can't guess which version has which features. You're like, wait a minute, which was the one which had the broken thing for this? Because the features don't mean anything. But if there's versions 2, 3, 4, 5, you can go 5 is the one with this, 4 is the one with this. Very clear,
Okay, so here is a counter argument that Unity itself kind of had to deal with, and then decidedly chose to hard lock things together. Scriptable render pipelines. We all hate them. But so when it first launched, you could download them as packages. And you could do that on any Unity version. And you'd find bugs, because some of them were made only with features that the engine itself had to change for. So now you had to check explicitly that you are not over upgrading a package version so that your old version of the engine can't support it. But they didn't list that information easily or correctly, and nobody would read, because nobody reads the packages. So we ended up with a situation where there were too many faulty bugs because people mismatched a package version to the engine version. What Unity decided to do is lock the package manager to only provide the best version that is compatible with the engine
which is
version.
infuriating. Because a perfect example, I had this literally yesterday. I had a version of Unity, and I downloaded the input system, and the input system that it chose to give for me has the broken drop-down menu bug where it hides the button. Now, I know there's a higher version, but when I went to the version list, it didn't show me the higher version. I had to go to the package manager and change the number myself in the file to get it to bypass its own max limit.
You can force type it in too if you put the version number in with, and if you copy in the name or the address.
You can add package by name, say the full name, and then the version number.
And be very explicit on the version. It's terrible. Don't get me wrong. It's not a better.
I do the same thing within the file. But the fact that it's like Unity is literally like, oh no, there's no versions higher than this. I'm like, I know there is. I literally know there is. And I have to go to the file and modify the file because Unity has decided in their infinite wisdom to disallow me from deciding.
It'd be nice. Yeah, you could just show them all and say recommended next to this one. Like, hey, this one's verified with your version. You don't have to hide them. Like,
Yeah, but again, there are reasons why they chose not to do it, because there are literal incompatibilities. If you choose to do it, you may break your project, break all the assets that are generated by the assemblies that are now failing to load or loading partially. Now, I'm not saying this is better or that is better. What I am saying is that I want everything to work when I'm starting a project. And if I'm saying everything is made for this one version of the main product, that is better.
I know. I just go by the
I
very
don't care
simple
what the
metric
number
that-
is, as long as it works like that. If all
Sure.
the assets went with, this is a Unity 6 version of the asset, this is called X4 Unity 6, perfect. Wouldn't mind.
I just go. Here's a very simple version, right? Imagine you and your friend are starting a new project, one in Unity and one in Unreal. You go to Unreal and say, which version are we on? We're on 5. Cool. You go to Unity and say, which version are we on? Let me check. Because I don't know. I have to go check whether we're on.
No, this argument just doesn't work. When you're working with Unreal, you have to also include the minor versions as well. And Unity is just like that. And if you can't remember a single number because it has 4 digits instead of 1 digit, I'm sorry.
Because it's more in Unity, you have to go to 4th digit after the comma to be sure you're having the same exact good working version with everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to. You know why? You know I check it so many times. I know how many versions I have.
Well, at least Unity doesn't force updates on you. You know, at work, IT will update our machines remotely. And this week they updated our Visual Studio, which broke one of my projects because of the .NET version we were targeting. And then they also updated our node in NPM, which we needed. I had to go downgrade both in order to be able to build the project that I'm working on. So I like having the choice to be able to decide if I want to upgrade something.
You don't want to be forced into upgrades and break everything?
No. And I do not like being an early adopter. It's been bitten me too many times.
Yeah, I'm the same, and I do think it should be literally illegal to force an upgrade and remove a feature. I think that is horrible. That's the worst thing a company can do. It's when you upgrade a system and actively remove something as you upgrade with a forced upgrade. That's infuriating.
It looks like most of our people like the simpler version numbers. It was 72 to 24%, with 4% clicking on a question mark. I'm just curious. I'm going to do a couple more polls. There's a couple other things I'm kind of curious about, like what version of Unity people are using.
Can I name all of them?
No. You're not allowed to. No, because we only have 5 spots, so that's why.
I'm on 2022.
Let me check. Can I put it in? I can't put it in chat. I will have to.
Okay. While you're figuring that out, there is an interesting question in the comments. Is there a way to highlight a single object akin to World of Warcraft on mouse over? Maybe use post-processing or a single object or something. I think there are a lot of approaches here, so I want to see what you guys would go with.
Okay, highlighting them with mouse over. There are definitely a lot. The easiest one, you could go get the Connect asset that does an outline highlight on mouse over built in automatically, and you just go add that component and it'll pretty much work.
Does that work with the standard built-in pipeline?
I think there's a version for each pipeline. I think there's a URP built in and HDRP, but it is like the outline one, and it's. I mean, if you just want that in there and you don't want to spend the time coding it, I think it's like $20 or $30 and comes with a bunch of other stuff and does all of that and shows how to do it. Or you can spend some effort and do the shader work yourself. Or I think there are a couple of different options. But anybody want to go with a non-asset store option?
Sure.
Write your own outline shader.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There is actually an easier way. A far easier way if you're on a recent Unity version. So Unity has render passes now. You can add renderer features that have a render pass, that the render pass will just render whatever you tell it to. And one of those renderer features that are built into most of the scriptable render pipeline is the render objects feature, which will only render specific objects that you tell it to. Now, the way this works right now is that you have to use renderer layers or specific physics layers or any sort of tagging for a specific shader. But you can explicitly say, hey, draw this kind of filter of objects and do that ignoring depth. Now, what you can do with that is a very simple character extrude shader, which will just push all the vertices a bit outwards according to their normals, use a flat color, ignore the lighting, and then just say, for the character that is marked with the highlighted render layer tag, draw that. Now, you can highlight any amount of objects that you want. Almost zero code involved. Technically zero code involved. You just have to turn the layer on and off with whatever script you want. I think you can even do that with animations without code. And then you just make the shader in shader graph, which takes almost no code at all. You literally just plug in a flat color and push the vertices a bit out according to their normals. That's like 3 nodes. And you're done.
Another way I've done it is just have another material for when it's highlighted and just switch the material on mouse enter or mouse exit.
Yeah, I was going to say, it depends on how many items you have. There's a difference philosophically about whether you're doing a system which can be project-wide highlighting, like we're talking about, versus what I tend to do in most prototypes to start with is I just make a script with iPointer enter, iPointer exit support, and basically let the object decide. And the object initially might start by doing a property block color change, or maybe later on I have some registration system where any active object registers itself, and then that system decides what to do. And that system might use a shader, or it might use maybe the character waves when you mouse over, because that's a different philosophical question than like the actual overarching effect, you know.
Yeah.
There was a second question. Is it available in built-in? No, it's a render pipeline thing.
Yeah, the scriptable one. And real quick, for anybody who's curious about the Connect one, this is what it looks like. And it doesn't just do highlight. It does, it's kind of similar to some of the stuff they're talking about. I don't know why it's not.
Yeah, it has a bunch of them. I remember it has like almost like a cross-hatching version and a bunch of other interesting effects as well.
Yeah, here you can see, I guess maybe the pictures will show up. The video is not playing, but it does a bunch of different types of these kind of highlights, not just that. And it's only $30.
And yeah. It's essentially letting you render the object however you want, ignoring depth and in whatever style that you wish, which is great, specifically if you don't know how to do all of this stuff yourself, which most people who want to render things don't know how to render things. So.
But it's also more than that to me. Like, it's more a matter of like how much time are you willing to waste doing it, because it's not. Sometimes you'll find, I just want to do this quick thing, and you'll go down a rabbit hole, and you'll be like 2 weeks into when the whole point was doing something else, but you're actually doing shader stuff now, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. If it's just like a thing you just want in there to continue on with the game, it's kind of the way I would look at it. If it's something that's a core part of your game you really want to be perfect, then yeah.
Yeah, because this is one of those, like, when you know your own weaknesses. Like, that's one of mine, and here's a good example. I was writing some code, and I wanted to just save a variable, just like a lookup config variable. So I built a config system using JSON. Then I was like, well, if I'm doing saving, I want to save stuff that might have encryption. So I made a little encryption thing that would allow me to do, you know, to encrypt a hash value before I put it into the config file. But then I thought, what if I want to get it back, not just hash it? So I added support for cryptographic encryption, and it's like, okay, well, now I need stuff that'll generate salts and hashes. So I have a salt and hash generator, and so now I want to embed it with the config, because otherwise I don't have to like get these different systems. So I had to build extension functions that would allow me to say config.write encrypted or write decrypted, and you know, write the version. That, okay, well, now that I've got that, I have to make sure it works. And so when I went to work, I wanted to go do ChatGPT integration. So I built the ChatGPT API just as an excuse to use an API key so I can verify the hashing stuff works correctly. And then I did that, and I was like, okay, well, that kind of works, but you know, and basically by the time I'm done, I've written like 5 or 6 systems, and none of them are related to what my original problem was, because it's just easy to follow the chain of like fun stuff, you know?
Yeah. Also, the person is asking, the connect asset doesn't increase or decrease brightness, right? It only puts an overlay or outline over an object, right? So technically, you can change the rendering technique, but at that point, you're literally just getting into custom shaders. If you want to do brightness, you would just use an emission or just ignore lighting information to a certain degree as you're writing the shader. It's far easier than it sounds. Don't be afraid of it.
Yeah, but the Connect does it. Connect does, I think, outline, outer glow, inner glow, overlay, etc. So yeah, it does everything else.
Although keep in mind one thing, if you are going to be highlighting characters or anything with like multiple elements, you can get into some really interesting and weird issues with sub-highlighting, where it'll end up having body parts clipping. Now, there's ways around it, but it's not going to be a simple slap-on solution in some cases, depending on what you're doing.
Yeah. Especially if you're working with transparent objects, but let's not get into that. Yeah. So, do we want to segue into that lighting topic?
Yeah, let's do it. So let me pop it up real quick. I'm going to screen share, and we'll read it out, and then go from there into some more art and modding stuff. So here, let's zoom this one in. So it says, hey, I have another question regarding scene loading with additive and single scenes. So it says, right now I've split my scene into battle logic and battle environment. I load the logic as a single scene and then load the environment additively. But then the look of the scene, the lighting and skybox, is used from the battle logic one. So would it make more sense to load the environment single and then load additive scenes? Thanks in advance. And I thought this would be an interesting one for us to talk about, because this is something that I feel like everybody has run into at least once, and then probably some people multiple times until they figure out how to actually go about this. So anybody want to just jump in with their recommendations or maybe an explanation of what's going on and why that's happening first, and then some different possible ways that you guys like to resolve this? Paolo's probably got a lot, but go ahead, Yart.
So just on a very basic level, when you have a scene in Unity, that scene has some amount of environment information baked into it. What skybox you're using, what ambient lighting amount you're supposed to have, how the fog works in this scene. All of that is saved currently in recent versions of Unity into a specific asset that is tied to that scene. Now, when you have multiple scenes loaded, only one of them is marked as an active scene, and only that active scene's information is used for that purpose. Now, you can change the active scene at runtime. It doesn't relate to the loading methods. You can literally say, this is the active scene now, and then the lighting information changes accordingly. Now, when you have a BattleLogic main scene, the only one that is loaded, it is the active scene. When you load another scene additively, it does not become the active scene. Now, there are implications to changing the active scene, which is why a lot of people don't try and change it at runtime. Specifically, when you instantiate new game objects, they get instantiated to the active scene. Now, one neat thing in Unity 6, if you read the changelog, they actually added a method of instantiate that takes in a scene argument. So you can say instantiate to a specific scene. If you don't want to go with that, or you're using an older Unity version, you can actually move objects between scenes. There is a method specifically for that. The problem with that becomes when you have child-parent hierarchies, and you want to move a sub-object into a different scene. For whatever reason, a lot of people use objects as folders, so that would kind of matter for you at times. I just wanted to point it out. Now, this is all the information that's relevant for this specific part of the conversation, I believe. I'll let you guys take it.
Well, what would happen then if I have my main scene, I loaded another scene additively, and then I instantiate a new object and I set its parent transform to be something in the additive scene?
That has nothing special that would happen. Scenes are not like any...
But it would still be in the right place in the hierarchy, though, right? It would be...
He's asking if it would move scenes automatically if you just tried to set the transform parent to one that's in another scene.
I believe so, that it would move to the proper scene. It's a scene is essentially a root node, like an empty game object. Just everything sits under. It's not really a game object, but yeah.
I wasn't clear of what you were saying. Like it sounded like you were saying there would be issues with that, but no, there wouldn't be.
The issues is that you have to remember that you moved it to a different scene, and then if you unload additive scene, that object won't unload automatically. You have to. So if you moved it to different scene, then it will unload with that different scene, and you have to remember about that. It's lots of things you have to manage.
Yeah, I guess I don't think in terms of moving from one scene to another. It's just I'm just pairing it to this object, and it's going to live under that object. And then if it's a don't destroy unload object, I unparent it before I return it to the pool.
So another thing here is that don't destroy unload is its own scene, essentially. So
that's why you have to unparent them. They cannot be under anything else.
Yeah, but the thing is that you sometimes do want something parented under something else, like a character spawning a sword and holding the sword is under, but then you unload the scene, what happens to the sword? And that has multiple implications, especially if you're trying to unload certain assets, and the sword is part of a set of assets that is the scene that you loaded. Now you can't unload the assets until the sword is gone. So there are catches for that. Now, in regards to lighting specifically, the only thing you care about is what is the active scene and what profile it's using for that lighting information and the baked lighting that comes with it, if you baked any.
Also, you have to remember that in rendering pipelines, you can have the skyboxes and etc. be stored in the post-processing, the cloud and other things. So if you're additively loading something that has
oh yeah, I've had that when you load a second profile and it doubles down on stuff, and you get
profile that has higher value, then it can overcome you, and you have lighting for one scene, the volume. Post-processing volume from second one, and everything messes up. You have to manage that and check everything.
So what do you recommend? So maybe we just go around and see like what everybody does. Say you're setting up a game like this where you've got logic in one, and maybe you've got multiple different levels where maybe the lighting is different and the scenes are different. Would your process be load that other scene that's logic kind of additively or setting the other one active? Or are you going to go about putting this into the post-processing settings only in volumes? I was just kind of curious what everybody would recommend. Maybe get a couple ideas for people.
I will say, for me, my solution is simply that yes, the loading is part of the problem, but for me, the real problem is the logic problem of like who is in charge right now and which part am I running or which part am I doing. And so what I tend to do instead is I literally offload that, where I have my manager system or whatever, and whenever a new scene loads, it registers its logic center to the global thing. So a good example of this is like waypoints, as I used before, where when a scene loads in, it doesn't like control waypoints. It basically says, hey, waypoint manager, I'm active now. And it adds itself to the waypoint manager system. And then whenever I want to do something with waypoints, I've got a single location to solve that problem. So in this case, I'd probably treat it something similar. I would basically say that when a scene loads in, it registers and says, I'm now an active thing with some effects or visuals, and then someone else solves that problem. As for the actual structural part of it, I do tend to load environment and stuff first anyway, just for simplicity. But that's mostly because my reasoning is, when I want to do a quick reload, like replay the same level, I want it to be as fast as possible. And if you're refreshing and reloading only the played scene, the logic portion, everything else is going to be statically stuck anyway. So I kind of want all of the stuff that actively doesn't change to be the kind of the foundational portions. So yeah, I tend to load all the scenes from the environmental up, and then have the logic scenes register themselves with the manager, and then the manager is the thing I actually evaluates what should be active at any given time, and then refreshes will refresh whatever the logic scene is.
On my own end, I basically try and keep everything as granular as possible, so the least amount of extra managers and loading and whatever. You can, in recent Unity versions at least, you have Lightning settings assets, and you can actually set it in a script. So if you really want to, you can just have the battle logic and set that lighting setting asset at runtime, and that should work. If I recall, I have not actually messed with that because I try to keep the least amount of baked lighting information that I can. I actively hate baked lighting and any amount of lighting setting, and you can change some of those fields at runtime. I always choose to do that. But that's mostly because like I try to create dynamic experiences, and you literally can't have almost anything baked if you're trying to do a living, breathing world that has like a day-night cycle, weather, have what have you. If you're trying to do closed rooms that are different scenes, that's a different story, but my use cases have never gotten into that.
Well, to piggyback on what Dave said in the chat, he mentioned menus. I always additively load my UI scenes. So anything that's UI, especially if there's different UI for different scenes, I have a different additive scene for that. But most of the time, the UI is shared across multiple scenes. So if I have different levels in my game, I'm always going to have score and the number of players left and, different things like that. And that isn't going to change between levels. And so those I always load additively.
That actually reminds me of something pretty important to mention. In the new rendering samples, the ones that they made for URP with the whole fancy teleportation area that goes into like that Japanese resting place and all that, they actually have special code that says when you are looking at those extra other rooms, change the main lighting as you render the camera for those places, which was really interesting. So they have a script that basically says when you are in that area, render those extra places to a render texture, but before doing that, also change the main lighting to theirs.
Haven't dug into that.
Memorize pathing I have no idea what's going with that.
Yeah, you're just flickering away.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it depends on type of the game. Yeah, it strongly depends on type of the game. If you're making big open world game, yeah, then you should have the main environment as the main scene, and then additively add everything else, part of the worlds, UIs, and everything else. Yeah, but I would mostly I would always suggest that the main scene has the logic. Yeah, has the logic. Has the environment data with lightning data in it, and then additively add the other parts of the environment. For smaller games, it depends how you change the graphics. Yeah, I would also have separate scene that loads everything else. Yeah, the scene that has logic, that has inside of it the data for the lightning and everything else, and then load environment.
But that is a good point, by the way. Each of us are giving it from the bias of our own. Like for me, I do a lot of VR stuff, and so VR is like, we love baked lighting. We want lots of baked lighting, and we want to use the standard scene with baked light. So yeah, it is very much like what you're building to.
Yeah, but again, exactly. This is all just lighting asset in the end, though. You just need to switch the lighting settings asset.
Yeah, but with the asset, with the game that has lots of baked asset, I would start with the scene that has the baked asset in it. Yeah, because problems with light maps can vary on the version of Unity.
Yeah, but you're basically saying because I can't trust the engine, I'm going to try and do whatever makes the engine screw up the least. When in reality, you kind of want the most empty scene possible when you are actually starting an executable, specifically because an application wants to boot up as quick as possible for sometimes.
Yeah, but we are talking about loading the level, yeah?
Yeah.
Loading the level is second moment. I'm not talking about loading the game. If you're loading the game, you're loading menus and everything that's in the menus. It can be split in different way. Yeah, but if you're going into loading level, you can just load loading scene and then do everything in the background. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Also, I'm seeing a lot of talk in the background, specifically with Dave, about UI scenes and loading them separately. The one thing that I would say there is that I do that, and I also make them independent. So what I would do is I would have a specific object in the UI scene that says, hey, you may need to bind to certain things. For example, the player. If there is no player, because you're just the UI scene and I don't want the player there, here is a mock object. Only use this if you are the active scene, because the UI scene will never be the active scene in my game. And then the game just plugs into that, and then I can control everything. And I even have like debug menu buttons on the inspector for that mock player object. So just wanted to bring that up. It's a very useful thing to have when you can have an additive scene that you don't need to load additively.
Yeah, I remember finding there's an old framework called Devoid UI framework, and when I was doing my research to this, I tried like 10 different frameworks, and that one I loved a bunch of ideas in it, and so I ended up taking a bunch of them for myself. And one of them is the idea that yes, you have a UI scene, but the UI scene actually is more complicated in that it handles the layering problem. So you basically make a bunch of canvases that represent each of the layers that might be relevant to you, as well as canvases that represent static objects or things that are going to be dynamically shifting. And then when you register items, you register them as pop-up or UI or modal or whatever, and it'll understand how to pop up to the right thing. And then as for the communication layer, talking about what Dave mentioned about multiple parallel workflows, I would create an event system, either signals or a topic pattern, and that way the actual UI wouldn't use data inherently itself. It would receive and subscribe to events with no references to anything at all. And that way the individual prefabs could be developed with the presumption that they receive events that have objects they need to do their work, and there's no binding to anything. And then when a scene loads in, like I said, the scene registers itself with the manager, which hooks up any Blackboard relevant data, and then each scene can be standalone, because the benefit of that is each prefab can be developed in isolation. And then on top of that, something else that can be a problem is if you have a prefab manager, which is like all scenes with the prefabs in them, you end up having to open the parent prefab and it gets messy. So what I do instead is I have a scriptable object which has all of the scenes, all of the UI elements in it that may be pooled or needed. And then what happens is at runtime, the UI scene will load that scriptable object, instantiate all of the prefabbed UI components like modals, then turn them off as like a pull thing. And then you can say go to scene and it will open up that one. It's a bit convoluted, but the reason you do that is if someone wants to go in and modify a single like screen, like the login screen, it's not going to cause any like prefab changes to anything else, and it's not going to cause any event references. And each person can then handle each prefab in isolation, load it, change it, whatever, change what events is registered to and from, and then anybody anywhere can call back or set player or select object 5, and it doesn't affect anything else because it's using a global signal bus and it doesn't have any prefab nesting thing. I can't take all the credit. A lot of that came from research into this on different people's UI systems, and this one called the Devoid Framework had a lot of those ideas, and I was like, this works. This is a very clever solution to a lot of problems. So.
It sounds very complicated too, though.
It is, yeah. It's pretty complicated.
It's actually rather simpler because all you're doing essentially is saying, okay, make everything in a granular piece as possible, and then just let it all pipe up to one system that just takes care of it.
Yeah, like in use, it's very simple because literally all you do is you say UI system.show and you pass in an ID for a scene. It'll do it. Or show ID, game object. It'll pass in the scene, send that object data. And any events are now treated no longer as like find UI scene call back button. You just basically say back button. And back is like will trigger whatever that means. And if you want to get even fancier with it, I've talked before about the concept of a topic event system as opposed to a signal event system. And that basically means that your events can have bubbling in different directions as well as wildcards. And with that, it's really handy because you can start to do things like have different scenes where you can actually do the activity-based approach where you can literally launch into a UI on a certain tab, where you'll basically say, show this tab, show this UI, go to this tab, and select this element, all by using colon syntax into an event structure. And what happens is the screen can listen to the event, parse out the parameter structure, and then like use it to internally navigate. And you get a lot of really cool granularity with that. But again, it's as complicated as you want it to be. At a very basic level, it's just have a scene has manager has list of objects, and then it takes an event that says show 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's the basic version. But then as you get more complicated, you add layers so that you can have, again, the overdraw layer that's always on top of everything else. You don't have to worry too much about stuff being like for each other. Then later on, you add things like, again, pulls if you want to have loads of modals or notifications, and it kind of, again, it's as complicated as the feature set you require, basically. But it's broadly an MVP structure with a signal pattern. They're the two like keywords to get started, and then past that point, you just sort of modify elements that work for you.
That actually reminds me of something that I kind of want to talk about, if possible. So one way I would look at that kind of system is something that I actually talked about last night on Story Server in Unreal context and in physics, actually. So Unreal Engine in 5.4, which recently released alongside its gigantic motion matching package, there's actually something less talked about, which is an experimental version of their Mover 2.0. Now, just for a tiny amount of history here, Unreal Engine has characters. Characters have to move. Traditionally, this has been done with the Mover class. The Mover has limitations. Specifically, it has to be a capsule. It has some specific hard-coded methods. It only has a few amounts of movement modes that it has, like swimming, jumping, running, and everything else counted as a custom mode. Mover 2.0 undoes all of that. And the way that they chose to let you add new movement modes is actually through string keys. So you would now have a locomotion name with a locomotion movement mode class. And you'll have a ziplining name for a ziplining movement mode class. And then game scripts would say, when you're interacting with the zipline, Mover 2.0 use ziplining mode. And this is both genius and frustrating. And I want to talk about why. So, very shortly, when you use stringly names, you have the potential for typos. All that the strings are doing is acting as keys. And I'm being extremely frustrated when I'm giving a chance to screw up my keys. One way that I see that is far more appealing to me is using whatever the engine has as dummy objects that are unique keys. So, for example, in Unity, I would use the plan scriptable object with a name. And then once it's been created and it has been named, it's referenced in point one. And I'm saying, hey, from point two, use that key in point one. I know that there is no chance to make any mistake anymore. So I'm kind of sad that the way that they've chosen to make this example is by stringly names for those movement modes. But in the UI context, it actually has a lot more use, because you don't want to create unique keys when you have an infinite amount of elements. But those keys can still act as context, and then you can provide extra information alongside it. So, for example, use the inventory items key with an index of 52, and then it's using the 52nd item. So that's something that I subscribe to a lot more when I'm working with UI systems. If I want to expose something to an editor, I try to make sure that there is no chance to make typos in it. So I'll use strings, but I'll try to provide as much context as I can with like actual factual context info items. In Terraria, we actually use integers for everything. So we have a context integer, which basically is an enum of like, this is an inventory item, this is an equipment slot, this is this specific equipment slot is only used for a mount, this is only used for a pet, and this is used for the trash item, this is a shop item, this is a temporary shop item, etc. And then we also provide the index within that context, and those indexes can have like extra special code for them. And that system works really well for just drawing everything nicely and having the unique logic based on the context and whatever index you're working with. For example, we have a thing that cycles which items you're using. So if you right-click an equipment accessory, it will actually start cycling it across all your slots. So you can be in your inventory and right-click on like 8 accessories, and it will just equip all of them. This is because we have all that extra information within the context of the slots that we are interacting with. Just something nice that I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I have not used this Mover 2.0 at all. I also really hate string keys myself too. Like I remember so many times running into problems in multiple different games, especially in MMOs, but in lots of other stuff where it's literally just string keys are almost always. I would say I've never had a situation where I didn't spend a day's debugging stupid string keys in some game. Every single game that I've worked on that had them for something, I've wasted at least multiple days worth of time debugging them, trying to figure out why, because somebody used the wrong character, spelled something wrong, something was case sensitive on one fucking system and not the other, or there was a space or any other random thing that was missed in there. There's always a problem. I hate them to death.
It's actually funny. I've completely 180'd in that too. I used to hate them for years. And then I watched an 1.5-hour talk from Bob Martin on the whole. We're talking about dependency inversion and the idea of DLLs and boundary crossing and all that stuff. And the video itself had a few ideas, but it wasn't what changed my mind. It was that like, okay, I need to sit and think about this, because I have a sort of bias against the exact problem you said, which is strings equals mistakes and human mistakes, whatever.
Strings that are not constrained. If you can do it like your database keys and they're constrained, and they have to be required, or your tooling can constrain them, cool. If not, then yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
But what I realize is that the freedom, the point of a string is that it lets you send a request without detailing the details, and the flexibility of that downstream is so high that so many other things value from it, that I realize that I'm on board, with the one caveat being my solution now is that it's kind of like we were saying earlier, it's not a problem with strings, it's a problem with validation and understanding when it works or doesn't. And so I realized that actually I love using stringly based stuff, because again, it lets you cross boundaries without object passing. It lets you basically send a request where the receiver can use the ID to look other information up and gather the information it needs, and you don't have to send information across the wire, which simplifies calls, simplifies requests, easier to serialize, a million different amazing benefits. And so the downstream effect is, in order to solve the problem you're describing, the answer isn't actually strings at all, it's misses. and people tend to swallow misses when they get a show object with ID blah blah blah. That just tends to disappear because it didn't match. The trick is presume that IDs are meant to resolve to something, and if they fail, that's a bad thing. That means that something is assumed to be there that isn't. And so as long as you track that and log it, but not like in a sea of logs where you're not going to see it. I would have a dedicated ID log, separate thing going ID misses, and then now I have a place to look at whenever something goes wrong that misses an ID match. And it's not always a guarantee, but it means you can at least know when you know that there's a problem to look up. That's the first place to look for that.
I just want to clarify real quick on what too. If it's just programmers sending me strings and stuff, I'm all good with it. The part where I've had the problem, and it has been consistent, has been when it's designers that need to enter the data and they're entering the strings, because I am 100% guaranteed to have mistakes and typos, and it's not like a mistake. It's a mistake and typo that's like comes with a person coming to ask me a question. No matter how much stuff I put in there, I'm still going to get the person coming to ask me the question.
That's what's going to happen. But I guess my point would be that's one of those things where as soon as it starts to become a real problem, that's where you build a tool that basically says export all of the available keys in the system to a Google Sheet and then create a validate button or a custom script that basically says, before you send it to me, this will run through and let you know if anything's not there or something.
So I just want to clarify here. The main problem is that we have keys and we are using passwords as keys. The idea that you type in a string means you are now putting in a full password to get to the right thing every single time. We invented keys so that we don't have to make mistakes with the passwords. Once you have a key, you put it in, you have absolutely no chance to fail. This is the one key that always corresponds to the one thing. And unique IDs is literally what solves it. If you have any form of unique key, I don't care if it's a string, if it's an int, if it's an enum, if it's an object, I don't care. As long as you know that only this set of keys exists and that everything corresponds to them properly, use whatever. The problem isn't strings. I'm perfectly fine with using strings. I am perfectly fine with stringly implementation. Just don't let me input them.
Don't let you put a bad one in.
Yeah.
And to be fair, Unity editor tooling, providing you're in the editor, allows you a million ways to solve that. Like you can literally draw any custom drawer that drops down. And I'm still amazed that Unity didn't have a default version for things like tags and labels, and people still have to go and reinvent their own for ages in a lot of these cases. But or even the fact that there's not a generic one, that you can't just say, like, yes, you can use enums, but there's no way of just saying like this is a lookup list. That's one of those things again that is very Odin is obviously noted as an important thing. You need a list of keys and some way to define a thing that is locked to that particular list of keys. Yeah, so it's such a common problem that
It actually, I had a problem with a friend's project that drove me insane for like a good 7 minutes or so. I went to a studio of a friend. He had a problem. He asked me to try and look into it. Basically, they used labels. They used labels to assign extra scripts to their content. One thing that they did was that they had a sword tag. One of the designers added a swords label instead of a sword label. The one added S. Because the system says, okay, I never saw this before. I'm adding it.
Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I will say this
The worst, right?
This is a little bit of a tangent because it's slightly off topic, but it's very interesting to me. We're getting into a different problem here, and I actually learned about this when researching search, like the concept of search engines. What you're getting into here is called tokenization, and there's actually that's not a problem with the tags per se. That's a problem with how the tag resolvers are working. Because what you should do is your tag system should take in the word they want, and it should automatically remove case structure, remove the S's and stuff, and it should singlify it to a thing. And a lot of tokenizers will do this. It'll basically say, take all the stuff, homogenize it down to this, remove the as, the ums, the whatever, and make everything be a single and then use that as your base plate. And it's a really handy way to kind of ensure that as a separate pass level. But this is a whole separate thing. But it means that if you're doing searches, like I said, if you're doing a search into a search engine, you don't want a different response from something with, plural and single when you're actually looking up one thing.
I would say that the problem is actually more like on a user case scenario where you want to be able to add new entries only in a single specific spot and every other spot should be banned from adding it. If you are, as a consumer, trying to consume the system and add tags, you should only be able to add tags, not create new tags. This is not a get or add, this is a get. And it should only stay as a get. But Unity right now with the label system is a get or add.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I just mean from a user experience perspective, I agree with you conceptually, but I find that there's so many cases where you're halfway down a chain and you're trying to do something and you want to add a tag and realize the tag you want isn't there. And so some of them will let you type it in and enter it. It makes one. If it doesn't, you end up having to either back out, go to a different system and add tags, or go ask somebody, and it's a real nightmare. So I'm a big fan of, like, from a user-friendly perspective, allowing them to be created, but then allowing them to create it, and if they match something else or something, resolve at the moment and say, actually, there's already one that fills your use case. You shouldn't make this.
Counterpoint, if you are trying to add something and you absolutely want get or add, make the add a model prompt, take user attention away, say, hey, this actually doesn't exist. You're currently trying to consume the system. Are you sure you want to create a new one? Also, here are similar ones. Do you want to use any of them instead? That would work.
I would just skip down to just allowing them to select. Keep it simple, but or have a button that pops up the thing. But there was one other topic I want to make sure we get to today, though, with the modding. You guys have more on this you want to go on to, or do we jump over to that?
No, I was just going to say that the last thing is that the BTV mentioned something which basically, that's really good. That's generally the idea of having a syntax tree. My talk where I talked about search, I mentioned that, and it's basically that you whenever you take input text, it's the same thing of how parsers and stuff work in general. You basically eat the sentence structurally as you go through it, and you break it up into literals versus operators. And once you've got that, you've built a tree structure that you can walk to resolve. And then whatever system you've got that basically does a search or does a find walks your tree and says, oh, this is a filter, this is an add, this is a keyword, and it builds the query and then structures it. And it's really useful. If you combine that with something called the specification pattern, you can parse the tree into a file. The file is like a JSON config saying, here's the whitelist, here's the blacklist, here's the includes, here's the whatever, and you can now save that as a pre-existing query or search. And that's a really useful way to have, like, drop down pre-existing searches. It's just, there's a lot of really nice stuff in this area when it comes to building custom searches and tooling.
Yep, I built multiple of these for all kinds of different systems, and these are exactly the kind of places where the designers would often put in the wrong thing. The condition would be slightly wrong, or the key would be wrong. And actually, to be fair, the solution was go in and build the tooling so that they can't, so that it verifies, validates everything inside the tooling. For some of the games that actually got done and worked out well, but I mean, you're still fighting through the problem the entire time till that tooling's there. But
rule engines are like that in general. Like, I would say here's the thing is that rule engines are horrible for programmers. Every programmer's ever had to work one usually hates it at some point for that reason. But it's very easy to see why. It's because every time something goes wrong, it has to be a user's fault because the system is just letting the user work. But the other thing is you don't see is all of the times it does work for you. Like, I very much used to hate it until I literally went to an office where people were using the tools like this. And I realized, oh, I'm watching like 300 people use this every day. And will I get annoyed by getting 10 queries a day? How much would I get if they weren't using a tool where they were doing it themselves and helping each other in common problems? So it's one of those things where it becomes more frustrating because it's more visible to you. But in practice, I begrudgingly admit it actually is often better in a large case because the amount of plumbing work you don't have to do is kind of offloaded. And then, as you said, once stuff becomes another problem, you just keep stacking tooling until you can offload it to somebody else. But it can be quite cool, but it's very frustrating when you're working on it at first, 100%.
Yeah, also, I'd say have to watch out for when there are problems with the tooling and there are those bugs and stuff where people are making those mistakes. Another thing that I've seen happen multiple times is that people just kind of stop using it because they become afraid that they're going to break it, they're going to do it wrong, and they're just not going to be able to get it right. So they don't use it, and then they go on to something either simpler or way more complicated and convoluted to try to solve their problem.
Yeah.
So,
or the opposite, which is they keep wanting to add features, so they keep bugging you for more toys to play into the thing. And then at first you're probably thinking, I have to make sure it all works within the system that's there. By the end of it, you get frustrated and just start adding any feature they ask for until they can wrap themselves in knots. Now you've got more trouble to deal with on the back end than you would have done had you just done it yourself. So that's the other thing too, is you have to like lock yourself in and go, every feature I add, I'm going to make sure is sustainable for me going forward. And if something is a pain in the ass, I would rather like take it on myself rather than build a tool that allows people to make more messes. Like I did a system before where people could make things, and one of the things I added was a way for people to generate graphs. And they could generate graphs by using something like a modified version of the high chart graphing structure, which is basically just a JSON object where you define different things. But there's so many ways to get it wrong, because you have to have the right number of series to match the right number of chart types, all of this stuff, that it ended up being more work for me to resolve it than the stuff that I was giving them to do. So I ended up changing it into a make chart function where you don't get all the toys. You just have to give me the data and I'll do half the work. But the trade-off is that, like, again, it worked more times than it didn't. When before I would get random bugs and they were like, your system's broken. And I would say, go back and read your thing. I know it's your thing. It's broken. Don't bother me. And so, yeah, it's a trade-off 100%.
So if we are moving to modding, there is one topic I can kind of segue in here while we're still on the topic of labels and rule engines. So there is actually a Unity blog post that I can't find right now, but it basically talked about ways to hack the entire editor to support creating content faster. And one of the things that the Unity developer who made that post did there was it parsed file names. It found what kind of file it should be based on the folder it was in and the name that it had. It automatically labeled the file based on the name and location the file had. And then from those labels, it automatically assigned import scripts for the file. So if it was a model and it got the blue team assignment and it got the unit assignment, it would use the unit's material. It would create a material for the unit shader, and then it would assign the color blue to it, and then it would like do the entire thing so the asset is immediately ready for use in the game just by being created and named in a specific way. Now,
yeah, that can work really well. Code by convention, they call it, and then you end up getting into these interesting scenarios where the names, if the name matches a certain thing, lots of magic happens. If it doesn't, other stuff goes wrong, and it gets yeah. Spring does that a lot, and it can get really hairy when it goes wrong, but it's really useful when it works. So that's definitely a team training problem.
Yeah. So we want to talk about modding and adding content fast.
Yeah, so let's. I'm going to start just with an actual problem that we're looking at solving in the near future, and I think it's one that's relatively common and then ties in really well with user-based modding. So, got a scenario with game with artists that have changes that they make, and sometimes those changes require the whole build pipeline and process. They require somebody else to put stuff into the game before they can actually see it with the exact lighting and all the other things around it. So it could be something as simple as a texture change for a character, or maybe a background or an icon, any of those like relatively simple things. Probably not so much on a mesh or anything, but mostly on the texturing, the 2D stuff. So the plan or the goal is simplify that so that, artists can maybe save a file, refresh, or save a file, hit a button, or save a file and nothing. And it just, using a file watcher checks to see that something has changed and then updates in game instantly. So you can go in, Photoshop, save, boom, see the new version, save again, and kind of see it live in there. And there are, I've seen, I don't know how many different ways to kind of go about this, but curious what everybody would do with the latest versions of Unity specifically to kind of solve this problem. What are some of the options that you do? And then what maybe ties in well with modding for players? Say we want to take the same thing and be like, hey, the players want to go put their face on now or whatever, or replace in a random skin or textures or any of that kind of stuff. You just want to put in their own icons. But yeah, so I'm sure your eyes got a million thoughts on it. Anybody that's got just a couple thoughts want to go before?
Yeah, before we get into the big thing, like I actually don't have a particular solution, so I'll let everyone else go. But I will say one thing beforehand. I just think it's worth mentioning because before we get into the topic, when people talk about mods or loading, it's often like, okay, you need a system, you need a big complicated thing. It's something to note just broadly. At the end of the day, there's data, which is, boils down to bytes. And as long as you can get your hands on the bytes you need and it can be loaded, you can pretty much do something. And so when we're about to get into lots of details and whatever, but fundamentally, like, this simply boils down to find a way to put your data somewhere, find your way to get that data from somewhere and do something with it. And it can be as simple as having, if your website has a version number for the latest version of your app, like a lot of apps will have this like update checker. It's like, oh, how are they doing that? They're literally just going to a URL and saying, does the text file at that URL have a different number in it than the one I think? Or say it could be something as simple as that. And so my point is, if you have a texture, and I'll do one last one, Gravatar is a universal avatar system. If you've made an avatar image of yourself, like a profile image on Gravatar, the way they work is they take your email address, they hash it a certain way, and that hash becomes a unique link to your image. And any app wants to like show your image from Gravatar, they don't need any login information, they don't need anything fancy. They just basically ask you for your email address, convert it to the hash, and they can get back your profile image just by loading it. It's not exactly a mod, but the point is that you can have an in-app icon relative to the person without special hookup code, without special modules. Now, to get into more detailed stuff, you will need some of that because of engine requirements and stuff, but it's just worth noting that when we're talking about this, don't freak out that it's too complicated. At the end of the day, all of these are just different solutions to the same problem of there's data, put it somewhere, get it somewhere, open it, and then resolve it in your engine to whatever you need it to do.
That was my Gravatar picture, by the way, of me coming down Splash Mountain with Derek a long time ago.
Yeah, I have. It's one of the like many scripts I have in my Unity helper library, just because it's so handy to be able to just say, if you happen to have an email address, automatically show a little image. It's just such a nice like helper thing. And even if you don't, it's got a bunch of other ones it generates for you. I don't use generative ones, but it is cool that you can just generate one whenever,
Yeah. I just wanted to say everything you said is like perfectly correct and the cleanest explanation of this. You just need to get the files and you do whatever you want with them once you get them. One thing of note is that when I started doing anything with servers, I had at one point been instructed to go and do like I think it was a touch command, like touch a file. Which literally just like doesn't do anything for it. It just changes the latest modified date, and that triggered an entire chain of event without even like writing a single new number in the file or anything like that. It literally just said, "Hey, this file has changed," and there is a system watching for file changes, and it saw that this file changed. It's going to trigger everything else now, and that was magical for me.
Actually, one last thing, because another version of that which is really fun too. If you ever worked in website, this is actually one of those hacks the other way around for the same problem. If you build websites and you make files for like how the UI of the website works, the browser will cache those files to avoid you loading them twice. So I've made a website and I've made a nice red banner for my website. Even if I make a new version with a replacement banner and I upload it to my website, the user is not going to see it because the app thinks, oh, I already have the banner. I don't need the banner that they've given me. So they'll get the old one. So what you can do is it's called cache busting, where literally the magic trick to making this work is you literally just append gibberish to the end of the file name when you rebuild the site so that the website goes, oh, this isn't the same file I had, so I have to re-get it. And so basically, if you're doing a website where you need a piece of the website to refresh correctly, you basically pre-pen gibberish every time. So when you reload the site, it forces it to keep having to re-get that one file, so it gets you the new version. So yeah, it's funny. It's literally just the name of the thing,
Yeah, and one important thing to mention here is that if you want to do iterative changes quickly, you want to actually also include the concept of knowing when you can get files. So you get data, you can use the data however you want. You also need to know when can you get new data. In Terraria, we have a system, specifically internally for development right now at least, but we have resource packs. Resource packs are just folders. If you include a folder and the folder matches the exact file path of an image used by the game will load the image from that folder. And we have a file watcher on the files within that folder structure. So if you have a resource pack loaded, everything under that resource pack gets notifications sent to the game saying this path of file has changed. And then we can say, hey, this path of file actually matches one of the game files. It has changed, means we can try and load it. And if we can try and load it, we can immediately try and display it in the game. So this is one of the ways that we let artists do immediate iteration, even as they're changing files in their program of choice, even as the game is running. And we actually put a little message that says, hey, we detected your change, we loaded it.
And actually, while we're talking about that too, it's slightly off tangent, but it's probably worth mentioning. there's a big difference between loading content in fully qualified forms versus like showing searches and lists. It's less of a thing in games unless you're doing like a literal store search front or something. But what a lot of things will do is real data is big. You want thumbnails and sample data to be smaller. So you literally create variant copies of things at small resolutions designed to be returned as your like first query to allow people to perform a search to get more. Or in the case of things like video, you can actually do it live with concepts of transcoding. So rather than sending the actual video, which might be quite big, you allow someone to request what bandwidth or what level they want to receive it at. And then when they request the stream to open, they send those requirements and the data can come in and basically be live converted as it gets sent to you. So if you're doing anything that's like stream data, like YouTube, for example, it's literally streaming the data to you with this like variations on it using a transcoding solution. That means they don't need to have like 50 copies of the same video with each variation. They just send you the version and code it in real time. Well, they probably do with 50 copies. It's probably easier for them, but most people wouldn't do it in this case. So yeah, it's just worth noting as well that like it's not just data. Data can be sent in different formats. Like you'll often want like the real version, or in the case of images, WebP or something to make it vastly smaller for the same amount of data and so on. And that gets into compression, which is a whole different conversation. But it's just worth noting that your data can often be sent differently. And the last part of that, the big hack, is the more information you can have locally on your device, the better in terms of relative for lookups. So for this stuff, if you can have things that can be reconstituted, the more stuff that you can offload to that, the better. Obviously, if you're like generating brand new data that gets injected, great. But ideally, you'd want to have stuff part of the build, and you basically use external flags more so because it'll make things instant. It avoids load issues. It has all sorts of other benefits downstream. Like if you're having like a mode that switches at a certain time, like special party mode, it would be ideal to have the party mode assets in the project, and then you fire the event flag elsewhere rather than having the stuff in it. Again, unless it's like brand new loaded in project.
Yeah, this actually. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say I want to kind of go to a just a Unity specific situation real quick, a little bit more technical on it, on the actual loading and replacing of the content in the game. So say we've got maybe there's just, let's start with some simple character in game standing there in scene playing. Want to replace the texture for say there's 20 characters, they all have a different texture. I want to be able to replace the texture or modify the texture of any of them at runtime without restarting, ideally. File watcher looking for the texture and then mapping that somehow to the character, or what
you mean
what do you
in a folder? You're saying like do they drop it in locally on their own folder? Is that what you're saying?
Ideally, yeah, they just drop it in locally on their own folder. They save and then they paint more, and they save and they paint more, and it keeps updating in game.
Okay, just not to get too abstract here, but I want to say it very cleanly. You need to know when your data is available. You need to be able to ingest that data, and then you need to be able to put that somewhere that you can see it. Mm-hmm. Now, all these 3 steps are very easy depending on how you prepare your game for them. So if you're trying to say, hey, replace the 4th character texture, what you need to do is say, I know that there is a path that corresponds to 4th character's texture. I don't care how it is. I don't care how you prepare it. I just need to know, hey, that exists. Then you need to watch for somewhere where things can change. Now, Unity's own editor has a thing that does file watching for you. When a file changes and you refocus the editor, it actually looks for any changes that occurred and tries to reload the files for it.
Arguably too often.
Yeah, arguably too often, and sometimes it will try and do it even at runtime, even if you're trying to change code, which is how you get those awkward.
Please add a way to turn that off, Unity.
Like, yeah.
Just let me pause it, do a lot of operations, and turn it back on again. Please, for the love of God. That's one feature I really want.
There is a way for that.
Is there? Okay, we need to talk, because that's one that drives me insane.
Sure, it's one of the.
I can do it in code, but I don't have to. There's not like a button. I can't just say I'm about to do a bunch of operations.
It's an editor. There is a hotkey. Not a big deal. Anyway.
Okay. Good.
So, as you have assets preparable, Unity actually disables asset change watching in most cases by default. I think right now, if you like make a new project, but you can change that, and if you change that, it will try and prepare the assets. Actually, when you're trying to do it in the editor, for example, for a shader graph asset, it will actually reload the entire shader graph shader result item in runtime. So that's why when you are in runtime, you can change the shader graph and see the results immediately. This also works for shader source code files. So when you change shader by text, it actually updates immediately, even at runtime, without any input from your end. This doesn't happen for assets that go through asset importers, if I recall correctly. So this is why textures don't do it, at least to my memory. I may be wrong here. But Unity does have methods for loading assets at runtime. Like you can literally say read PNG or whatever, and it loads that as a texture. And then you can set it.
Yeah, you literally on textures, there's texture.from whatever, and you can say same with audio as well. You can load audio from file stuff too. Although there's limitations obviously for types and what it supports and blah blah blah.
Yeah, and then you have to assign it to a material. So if it's a shared material, how do you assign it to all the instances of shared material, etc., etc.? Not a big deal though, as long as you know, hey, this is the character, it's currently loaded. If there is a file changed, try and load the texture from within what you have. Now, the problem becomes when you use more advanced file formats, or if you actually use important settings on the texture importer. Because when you're saying texture from PNG, you're not applying any of these settings. The texture importer actually does post-processing to the texture to be used in the project. And that kind of stuff you have to do by yourself. This is the part that kind of sucks. It also sucks in Terraria, by the way. Terraria doesn't have a lot of post-processing done to the textures, but XNA does have some property fields, and one of them is like, is alpha pre-multiplied? And if you don't want alpha to be pre-multiplied, you have to treat texture differently. You have to actually like load it and then do the pre-multiplying yourself. So that's one thing that you have to watch out for, specifically in the case of textures. But there isn't any magic. You just say, hey, a file changed. Hey, read it from PNG. Hey, apply it to what I'm seeing in my game.
Although one small side note, which is just kind of fun, is PNG feels magic, like it feels like a big scary thing. But you can actually write your own PNGs, and the format's relatively simple in terms of the structural thing. There's loads of guides online to like literally build a PNG from bytes, which is quite cool. And so if you have a utility library, I often have a bunch of helpers, including like converting formats if needed, without having to use a big fancy external library or something. Yeah. And that can be quite useful when you're getting something from the web which isn't in the format you need, and so you have to first convert it before you start doing the other fun toys. You know?
And just to clarify for everybody, this all, I mean, we talked a little bit about in the editor, but the texture loading and the file watching and everything you mentioned also work totally fine in a build that you're running, right? Like,
yeah. And I would say too, like, it's not even like we're using a file as an example, but again, I really want to stress this because it's one of those things where like even I spent years without like locking this in. Files aren't important. File is just you've taken a
but it is the way that like the artist or the player is going to deal with it usually.
Sure, but what I mean is like what I want people to focus on is the idea that as long as you can get a good example, what I mean is if you want to have a texture loaded, these may sound like different features to you. To say, one, you could have a file in a folder that gets loaded to a texture. Two, you could drag and drop an image onto the window and it would load it. Three, you can copy an image and paste it in. These feel like different features. They are not. They are all ways of taking the bytes from the file and placing them into the thing. And you might have to write some different handler code to say, unpack from the clipboard the byte array that represents the texture, blah, blah, blah. But my point is, if there's a piece of code that says, when given a byte array that represents a PNG, do stuff and resolve to character, you can generate that from a string code, which is actually just a base 64 encoded string that you paste in. You can generate that from a file. You can generate that from a clipboard. You can generate that from, whatever you like. And so the point is to keep in mind that we're talking about something resolves to bytes, and those bytes resolves to something, which then gets used in the thing. And that's really powerful because it means later on when you decide how many ways can I let people do this, maybe they can share codes, like I said, which are actually just a combination of I paint a picture, click save, it gives me a text string, which is again base 64 encoded string. When the other person pastes it, they decode it back to an image and can show it. Or maybe I let them save an image up somewhere and I get it back down again. What I'm saying is if you think about it as files, you have to keep thinking about this thing I have to move like it's an important object. It's not. It's a bucket. One method of bucket to pass information around. It's the most.
It is, but it's the bucket that I'm going to use. That's the thing. Like we could go all kinds of different routes, but the bucket I plan on using is the artist will export their PNG into a folder, probably match the file name 1-to-1 with what's in the project, so I don't have to have any external mapping and thinking about stuff. Or just go, hey, this is the name of the file. You can look it up. It should be the same. And then
but the reason I'm really, really focusing on this though is because think about things where you can log in on your profile and your profile image shows up. The way those tend to work is I've done my picking, I've dragged and dropped, I've selected an image or whatever. What's usually happening is that image then gets base64 encoded. They log into your profile and they assign a JSON value that has that text string of the base64 encoded thing, and the next time you log in anywhere, it pulls down your profile, which then reads the profile string value, unpacks it to the image, and then shows the image. Now, that's not a file. It was a file at one stage, but the point is you're now past the point where that's now attached to your profile or your account. And it's just worth knowing that, again, if you think about it in those terms, you have a lot more flexibility in, like, I can attach this to their config file or attach this to their profile or store it somewhere. You know?
But I'll probably save it off as a file later and cache it. Like once I grab it, I'll save that as their profile PNG and just reuse that unless it gets updated.
Yeah, so just to focus in on how to solve this for your developers, if you can find a way to enable Unity's actual asset importers within the project as the asset get changes, even if it's runtime, do that, because they likely have an access to a Unity editor instance available, and that saves you the most problems. If you can't, then you're going for a runtime-esque solution where you're saying read those files, do whatever you can for them. For textures, it's hella easy because Unity gives you a method for that. For models, absolute hell, never try.
I know people who made whole companies just doing the models in Unity.
And audio is just so impractical because, like, not everything in the fucking world is WAV file, and you actually do need to support more than the basic ones they let you load traditionally. And obviously, MP3 being the biggest, so you do need something. You need to have like NAudio or something to support that manually yourself.
Disagree here, because when you are telling people, okay, this is how you're going to work now, that's all you need. If you say you're going to be working with WAV files for the sake of iteration time, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
What I mean is, like, if you have a game that lets people put their own music in, you're not going to say step one, convert your music to WAV, right? That's not a
Yeah, I mean, okay, so for Terraria, we actually do audio modding, and we support MP3, OGG. I think we support a few more, but now it's escaping my head. But we basically have different libraries loading for that, and
but again, that's an asterisk difference of, are we talking about modders, or are we talking about users? And I think, at least my understanding is what Jason's saying is a user wants to do, I have this thing, I want this thing represented in my game, not a modder builds a system of stuff, right? So there's like a different...
This is more an artist wants quick iteration.
Well, in that case, then you can have rules, sure. You can say wave only, go...
wave, and then we'll convert it, I think would work fine. There was, I lost. So one more thing to make this way more complicated. Okay, let's say that the artist does not have Unity and the build is WebGL only.
Does WebGL have file access to your PC?
I don't remember anymore.
So if it does,
Firebase, you use Firebase, you do something that stores the images in Firebase, and you pull the images down from Firebase. That's what I would do. 100%.
I don't think you need that, because I'm pretty sure you can still do a file drop down where the user just uploads it to the context of the web browser, and then the web browser gives us the WebGL file. So this is literally just add a drop, like a button to open a file selector, and then from that file selector, once the file has been chosen, load that file and
that would make sense to do like an upload into there and then just match by file name.
It's not an upload, it's a select. It's still entirely locally on your PC. It's just provided to the WebGL build.
Yeah, I know that totally makes sense. That seems like the way to go, and it solves like this problem and some other one. So I think it'd be interesting. Well, I'll probably. Do you guys have more thoughts on this? Because I'm sure I'm going to come back with some more.
I would say the only reason I'd say too is that Obviously, I tend to lean in the more complicated solutions most of the time, but I want to, in defense of my reasoning, downstream usability things, right? There's stuff that sound fine now, but aren't later. A good example of this being at some point, someone's going to be, hey, I uploaded 3 ones. I want the one I used 3 times ago. And if you're not doing some kind of structure that manages that, from a usability thing, that can be quite frustrating. If you do have your own Firebase type solution, you can store the last 5 things they put up there, and you now have control over that, and you can reference it and do different stuff. And if you're willing to put that work up front, the amount of feature benefits you can do on that is quite nice. And the ability to switch between sharing or globals and stuff is now free, because you already have the concept of buckets online that have stuff, and people can mark them as being public available or not. If you're just doing the file load, which is, again, great for prototyping, but you hit the point where there's a lot of limitations on what that does. And so I tend to think in terms of doing client work. I know where this chain goes. I won't implement all the features that is required down the chain, but I'll do the version that will support it without me rewriting what's there where mostly possible. If it's not, again, prototyping just the idea concept.
Yeah. And right now it's really just trying to get a little bit of a speed up in a pipeline, cut people out of a pipeline for verification before things are actually good and submitted. Like,
yeah, honestly, in those cases,
artist verification.
In those cases, one thing we didn't talk about, but I think is a real, like, my solution to this actually is what I usually do. This sounds silly, but again, it's over-engineered to avoid this problem in future. Is I like building a drop bucket solution where you have so you can make applications, and people are used to making either like a Windows exe file or a console application, which is your CLI run in the terminal, whatever. There's actually a third thing you can do in Windows where you can actually make a service. And so if they're running Windows, you can register a service with Windows, and it will launch, have a timer start, and have whatever. If you know you're working with someone for a long term on a project, you can register a service which does this whole folder watching thing, and you can literally have some dedicated drop directory. And now you have a perpetual way at any point that they decide to drop assets into a directory, and you can run your process, do whatever you like, send them up to your buckets or servers and do stuff and resolve it yourself. And what this does is it's really handy, because it means when people want to do stuff, you can basically whenever you make stuff, put it here. And then I don't have to deal with whatever nonsense you're going to do with naming it correctly or putting it into whatever. Once it's dropped, you can parse it, read it, move it, put it into right directories, fire off events with GitHub or whatever else hooks you need, and then you can control the pipeline. Again, overkill for lots of stuff. But the idea, I'm just pointing out the fact that when you get to that point where you're trying to manage lots of stuff at once, a really useful thing is called an ingest pipeline. And an ingest pipeline is just data comes in wacky odd formats from 5 or 6 different sources. An example is I worked for a supermarket once I was working for a process provider for a supermarket that did demand planning. And so we would basically aggregate data from different sources, come up with charts, graphs, and stuff, and show them that. And so we're having to use the point of sale service tools. And each one's different. Each company provides a different data format for how they give you sale information. And so it's like we have lots of data to work with. And so we did ingest pipelines. We didn't ask them to do magic. We just said, give us the folder, drop the stuff of all the things you get from your system. We'll eat it, put it into our system, run it through online cloud processes we had, put it into our database in the correct formats, append the JSON that's like the matching original source version, and then overnight run aggregators that would then calculate summaries, totals, equations of whatever we think is valuable to you. And then by the time you come in the morning, the web page will have all the cool, fun facts for you. So we basically removed multiple phases of that problem by just basically having a drop bucket that we know they're using one of these 5 pipelines. If they drop it in, we can consume it. Again, depends on what you're doing, but it's worth thinking about it in terms of having this ingest. Now, if you are going to ingest, one last thing on that, be careful, because ingest has a very high chance of breaking data. Because if you ingest partially and it breaks, or there's something in the wrong format, you don't want to half take in data and then try and do it twice or whatever. So you actually need to have what's called transaction analysis. So you need to have the start of a process, start running a thing, and then if it fails, back out. A common solution to this is a triple bucket, where you have a not done, in progress, completed, and then possibly like a failed or canceled bucket. And as you take each file, you move it from the drop bucket into the in progress bucket, do all the stuff you need, and then when it's done, move it to complete, or move it into the failed. And that way, when you're done in the morning, you could leave it running overnight and see the bucket of files that were processed. They're not deleted, they're there, and see the bucket of files that were failed for whatever reason. And then you can open them or go back to the client and say, month January or whatever broke because your format was wrong, because your point of sale system had a tilde in the middle of this ID name or something silly and then fix that problem. And a bit of a tangent, but all I'm saying is that if you've got data that's interesting, you can do pipelining that makes it easier in places.
Yeah, definitely not going anywhere near that level of complexity here. And I mean, I see it in a big.
Just highlighting that it's there. When you start going down that road,
yeah, with a ton of people and a ton of stuff coming in, but that would be the exact opposite. Well, and the one thing I like that you started off, if they're using Windows, and we're talking about artists here, almost nope, most of them are.
Just use an S3 bucket and have a Lambda function that monitors it. And do the whole ingest pipeline in a web service.
You can do that too. It can just be a website you drop in.
I just want them to save the file locally and then say that it's good before they send it and say, hey, can you put this file in and show me if it's good? They're trying to cut the process down from days, not add 3 years to the development.
There are two types of people: the ones who want to read a file and the ones who want to write a whole AWS service.
I just want to see the file in game and see what it looks like and have them say yes or no, and then we'll put it in and we'll do it for the whole dozen of them, and then that'll be it.
There are a few things I want to mention though that are rather important if you are working with an artist, assuming that you are working on 2D. Art isn't in isolation. Sometimes the resolution changes. When resolution changes, you have a lot more problems than just replacing the texture. Because if the texture size isn't consistent or it has frames, because you're using Unity 2D, you need to know how to read those frames as well. You need to know how to resize the game object, which automatically sizes itself as far as Unity is concerned, for the purpose of using its own texture. That means you have to read extra information aside. It's a PNG, bro. And
aspect ratios with the pivot points and stuff too can mess up depending on how you're doing it as well. Which can
and custom anchor points and all that. Now,
these scenarios should all just be like updates, though. Just to clarify on mine, it's going to be like, hey, taking this file, modifying that file. It's the same file. They already have it. They're just changing it.
Yeah. Now, if you are only doing updates and it's the same resolution and everything, okay, great. If there are additive textures, sometimes you need to change something in the format. If you're doing anything with texture importers, sometimes you will have to do that conversion yourself when you're reading PNG. One more thing, if you want to allow them to edit actual game-related stuff, for example, unit stats or whatever, it means you need to start constructing your data. Okay, you're not going to do that?
No, that's already somewhere else. That's already handled.
Okay. One thing that I'll mention here quickly then, usually it just comes down to having data in a clean format, and there is one service that Unity has that doesn't absolutely suck, that works with data that is available. That's the cloud service where they let you upload customizable settings, and then you can load that in. Now, that's great, especially for a team of developers trying to adjust game design together. That's like the one case where I would say, okay, you don't want to change a Unity build, make a new one, and then give it to everybody. You don't want to read from a custom file. You want it to just change for all the players in the PlayStation. Use that service.
Go put it right up. No, that makes sense. Yeah. That could be a good way for quick testing and like sharing tested stuff too. I'm also a little bit curious about where the asset manager goes to. Maybe there'd be some tie in there with long-term asset management, but I mean, I don't see anything in my head with it, but I'm curious to maybe go there. Sorry, you're just gonna say something?
Oh yeah, the slight tangent, but I thought it was a fun addition. Because we're talking about configuration. Here's a very small example. Like I said, I was writing my own little ChatGPT consumer API script thing, and I was solving the problem of how do I get the API key. And it's like, well, okay, I have to, the person has to type it in and do all the stuff. And I supported all of that. And then I did, as I said, the encryption so that if you do store it, it's not like I'm not going to have your file stored or whatever. But then after going through all of this, I realized, hang on a second, I've got other tools on my system that use ChatGPT. Can I like go get the key there somewhere? And so my point is there's the environment configuration on your operating system. And if you are using something that's using some shared information that other services may or may not have, it's kind of like querying the browser cache for your website or something. Because if you don't know, if you're using the same library script for Bootstrap or whatever on your website, if someone else already has used the same one, it won't re-download it. You can save your loading by having pre-cached stuff that's common across the whole web. Similarly, if someone has keys already, you can do it. So my little system first supports checking your own system config. And so if some other tool has used the API key, registered it with your machine, you don't need to provide it for me. I can say, hey, I have one here. Do you want to use this instead? Just a small note that sometimes it's worth doing things like checking the system's own environment variables and stuff, because there's sometimes some things will like cross talk. And like, if I've built two different apps or two different games, maybe one game can store a config files. Again, probably use player press in that case, but my point is you can do cool stuff with that as well.
Yeah. So, real quick, pal, you got any thoughts on this? I got one really funny thing I wanted to talk about too before we run out of time. But you haven't really had a chance to talk about the modding stuff. So you got thoughts?
Depends if you are talking about modding or talking about artists checking if
I would say more about pipeline pipeline improvements ideally, but if there's any modding benefits as well too. But I think the pipeline improvements are kind of the key thing I'm curious about.
For pipeline improvements, mostly what I did for people, I did one of two things when I worked with artists and things showcasing them pipelines and stuff. One, I think is the simpler way for artists, words for the programmers, write a program that tests these tools. Write some small application that has the same rendering environment. It's Mac or PC application that just loads this and they can test them. Yeah. If it's a long-term project, it's more gain than checking web, GL, fighting with web development, and so on. Yeah,
it's like a cool little Windows client or something that runs. I was considering something like that too. Just do like a Windows client that's stripped down and just shows the things where they actually need to change out the art.
Yeah, because it's easier than writing some web tools or something like that. The small as small as the application can be, and as better than it can give you. Yeah, especially you can give additional informations there and additional checks that give info to the artist what they did good or what they did wrong. So what types of textures they used, is this textures good, if the model is good, if the amount of triangles we want to, etc., etc. It can be just written off quickly and checked. Second thing, words. Teach artists Unity. I did it in Nature Manufacture. We did it. We trained 3D artists the basics of Unity and made them. Always when we are preparing new assets, we are giving them Unity project where they can just drag 3D asset, that texture, and put it into a scene that's prepared that will be exactly the same settings that have them. Yeah, and sometimes small tool that resets the entire project if they do something wrong.
That reminds me of the whole Plastic SCM version control that they let you just import specific assets just for the artist's sake. Like, don't load the entire project. You don't need all the assets. You only care about the assets that you're working with. Now, I like the idea, but it's a flawed idea because then they don't know where the rest of the stuff are. By default, they have to start looking for it manually before starting to work with it, instead of just seeing everything that's there. So they don't have references to work with. They don't have a lot of the usual available context, and that can lower quality of work. And in regards to the Unity new asset manager, they show that there are improvements in there. None of them are relevant for what we are talking about today. The tool is very limited in purpose from what I've seen.
Yeah. So from my experience, I mostly did one of these two things. Yeah, depending if I can buy licenses for each of the artists, if I can give them the proper training, or if it's easier to have one programmer write something for them to use and check.
What did you find was generally easier? Because I mean, I could see both being useful. Like having them put stuff directly in would be great, unless you're running into this scenario of, hey, this doesn't work again, and having to go fix it, once a week or however often.
Longer term, it's better to teach them Unity and just give them Unity. But I wouldn't give them I would give them two projects. One is the full project that everyone is working. Second, smaller one that loads quicker, has less assets, and you can just quickly put something, check if it works, and that's everything. If they break on their computer the smaller project, they just unzip the project again, the new version, and just work on it. Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah. Well, anybody got any other thoughts on this before we move on? I want to take this one question in chat and then go to this funny topic. Yeah. All right.
I mean, we already talked about enough tool development here.
Yeah. Cool. So the question that was in chat that Jimmy asked, I think is interesting, was at a high level, how do you, from a technical perspective, implement like world phasing in a game? And saying for the purpose of the discussion, it's a super simple like single player game where you kind of progress through the world and then the world changes. So I think of phasing as like, the world, the environment's looking different. Environment is generally usually like the same models, the same general base world, but then the things in it, the lighting and the other stuff around it is changing. Now, I'm sure none of you have any thoughts or ideas on this.
No, I'm just brimming my excitement levels.
Whoever wants to take this, feel free. There's a million different ways you can go about it.
I wonder if anyone has any particular experience with this problem. Anyone here done it a lot, maybe, that might have some thoughts or.
You guys start first. I want to hear you.
Okay. I can. Sorry. Okay. So, when you talk about changing the world, all you care about is that new things are there and old things are gone. There is a very simple way to do that. It's called game objects. Enable them, disable them, use a timeline to animate whatever you want on them, doesn't matter. That part, very easy. If you want to then load the world in a state that it already has that, then you need to separate the process of them appearing from them being there. That's when actually having like the state and the timeline that you can just say, hey, skip to the last frame, don't actually do any of the events that are related to the timeline, just straight up get to the end, remove the timeline, you don't care about the timeline anymore, the new stuff is there. That's great, because now you can load a save wherein all that content is available. You offer the world such that it had an off state, it had a transition, it had an on state. You just put things in the on state or the off state, depending on when the player is. When they cause the change to happen, you just track a record of saying, okay, that change occurred, and now do the animation, and in the end, it's going to be in the on state. There isn't almost anything else that you have to do. Enemy spawning, new obstacles appearing, new quests being available, all of that can be described by this system alone. Granted, those are external like game systems that have nothing to do with it. Just them being there and them not being there is what matters. On a higher level, if you have records of the world having been changed, for example, if there were toxic areas and you remove the toxicity from those areas, you can have a record of that, and then you can pull for that record from any script within the game and have NPCs comment on that or anything else of that sort. You can also do it without the records and just letting them have a reference to the toxic area and saying, hey, is the toxic object enabled or not? If not, let the text play. Like, it doesn't matter. The entire thing is that there should be some inspectable value that says, hey, change has occurred, and also when change has occurred, make some transition occur. That's literally
I'm very much the same. There's basically, I think a better metaphor for this, rather than thinking in world streaming, it's more complicated, is just to think of a door. In old games, you'd open a door and you'd go into a room, and that room, like from a systems perspective, that door can go to any room, right? It's not really behind that room doesn't exist behind that door. In a lot of old games, you would like teleport somewhere else when the door opens. And so the question is where. You need some way to look it up, and then maybe the door goes somewhere different, the room that's full of people having a party, or the version of the room where nobody's there. The simple answer is just to have, again, some kind of flag or external metric for that. If you're getting into more complicated stuff where like the world gets attacked by a creature and the whole half the map gets destroyed, I would basically personally go, you build your map as you normally want it. You'd build the map that you wanted to look destroyed on top of it, almost identically in the same position conceptually, and then you effectively slice the world up into these chunks based on whatever world coordinate system you'd like, and then put them in a structure where the naming convention says it's from normal default world or modified world, and then you simply have a flag somewhere that says modified or not, and then when you enter the region and it goes to pick the correct scene to load, it just checks the flag and loads the one. It appends the prefix of the name or whatever before it loads, and then opens or loads the appropriate one. Although, as I'm sure will be pointed out later, the actual loading and unloading, or even the flag of is or isn't, is not the problem. None of these are really where any of the complexities really lies. It's more in terms of the streaming, the speed, and also dealing with things like the coordinate space of like how far ahead do you look ahead to load, and when do you get to safely unload something based on there's a lot more problems than the actual loading portion. From a complexity standpoint.
And just to clarify, you don't necessarily need a loading. If you want to go the lazy route and just have everything loaded and just disable the parts that you're not going to use until you plan to use them, that's perfectly fine. Like one of the examples is like base building. If you have a game with a static base where you just buy upgrades for the base, one thing you can do is treating the upgrades as records. Say whenever something gets and when an upgrade gets bought for the base, play a small animation that shows, hey, the upgrade is now appearing, and then after that's done, the upgrade game object is there and it's available. And then next time you enter that area, just have that game object already be enabled. Now, you can do this for things that are not like on off either. You can do like the sun is setting, so you have a value for time of day, and you're just keeping the record of the time of day, and then when you're facing the sun, you're just literally putting the sun in the proper position and changing the environment lighting to match whatever is going on there.
Yeah, because once you've got it resolved, it doesn't actually matter how you got there. A good example of this is, it sounds unintuitive to say this, but the way Minecraft would load your changes is basically you've built a world, you run 1,000 units and you dig 4 blocks down. How does it store that? Well, are you going to save the entire world? Probably not, because it's too big of a world. What you're going to do is you're going to regenerate the world and save the change blocks you've made. And so there's basically saying a chunk that says in this chunk of the world, they've modified these 4 blocks. And so that's the amount of information you need to save for that. And so basically it's that. You're changing, you've got a change set of some kind, whether that's addition or removal doesn't really matter. And you're saying, do the thing, and then put this thing on top of it, modify it, and now we're kind of starting our process from there. So it's basically that. It's have change sets, have flags, and modify this stuff with change sets from flags.
Yeah. And in case of like making the developer experience better, because I saw that in the comments, the less you do, the easier. The more you do, the more you have to keep record of. And I'm not talking about the records of having the data available for the game. I'm talking about keeping track of records of as a developer. Like if you are going to have 20 systems related to the state of the world, now you have to make sure that those 20 systems don't break. The less systems you involve in this, the easier it's going to be for you. So do with that what you will. For the record, Terraria has an entire thing called hard mode, where after you've beat a certain boss, the entire world changes. In practice, everything that occurs there is we set one boolean to true, and we have one single time event that goes through the entire world and starts converting it to the hard mode version, which all this does is literally just go in a certain pattern and start saying, if this block is a dirt block, convert it to that other block. If this block is a stone block, convert it to that other block. From that point on, everything that occurs is just using that one boolean saying, is it hard mode? And if it's hard mode, in the enemy spawning system, we spawn the new enemies for hard mode. If it's a damage calculation and we do something special for damage calculation, we use that boolean. Literally it. So, anything else?
I think you kind of covered it. I don't know if anybody's got other thoughts on it, but I mean, listen to the whole thing, and I think you've covered everything I was going to say and a lot more.
There is one more thing I should probably mention, which is if you want to do something more elaborate, Unity and Unreal both have seen additive loading, and they are both not directly made for dynamic world where everything can be changed in mind. This means they let you make more personalized constructed experience, single player game with the world changing, etc. And you can use layers within those scenes. So, for example, there is the environment of the Colosseum, and then there is the daytime version and the nighttime version. And the nighttime version has new objects for fires on the torches, where the daytime doesn't need them. So instead of having one scene with all of those objects available and then you having to tick them on or off, there is a single scene that says this is the Colosseum, and when it's night, that scene only has lights for the night. You can do that and then just load it in. You have to be careful about how you unload that if you want to let it be loaded in and out the same way while the player is still there. But one thing you can do to save yourself a lot of effort is just not change the progress of the world while the player is there, and just have a loading screen occur when the player is changing context. So, for example, if you go to a happy-go-lucky town and you enter the shop, and the shop has like a lot of fancy valuables, and then you progress through the story and the shop has been ransacked, the next time you enter the shop, you don't necessarily have to use the same shop scene. You can just go to a different scene that says it's a wrecked shop. And then you have to start tracking, like, as a developer, making sure that everything is in the same place. So if you moved a chair, that chair has to be the same.
Actually, a really good example of this. A really good example of this is something that people don't think about is cutscene NPCs. You'll often have a character who like walks in the frame, does a bunch of stuff in a cutscene, and then starts a fight. If you try to bake all the cutscene logic and stuff in with the combat sequencer, you're going to have a big pain in the ass. You'll notice if you actually look at the code for this stuff, there's often one T-posing character in one location, one T-posing character in another, and they'll swap them out. Or in games that have like basically just a long cutscene, a good example of this is all of the horror games. You know, those any of the ones where like you're being chased by monsters and stuff. There's literally like 50 versions of that monster, each with unique code for that 4-minute or 2-minute sequence littered throughout the level that hits on triggers. You do not need to have some super manager that handles everything at once. And so conceptually the same thing is if you have these different aspects of the project, make the versions that fit and just load in and load out the ones you need.
Yeah, I would add one thing. One thing that wasn't, I think, talked is about shaders. With shaders, you can hide and showcase many things. You can have assets that are not displayed until you lit them with some kind of lighting. You can have models that won't be showcased until there are some kind of volume or in FOV or something like that. That can change.
Remember that one Antichamber, which had the whole like it used the Z buffer thing. It had the different boxes you could go.
I gave you the link, Jason, if you can showcase it. It's from a game that's I don't know if it was released, the new Lords of Fallen Dual Worlds. They have a video that showcases two worlds that are overlapping in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's the worst case scenario that you can have. That you have two worlds that are rendering at the same time, depending on what you see and what you will do with them.
And they're both simulating full logic, and they have to do that in parallel, even if you're not seeing it, because if you're seeing even one pixel, everything has to be prepared for you.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the worst case scenario. You have to most likely, I don't know the code of them, have two different cameras rendering at the same time and cross processing, doubling them down what you see.
And the other stuff too you're not thinking about, because you might save all the processing by whatever, doing rendering or different models, but then the different shapes might have different colliders, and so you might have a different layer of collider shapes.
That's what I was going to. Then you have to check which collider works when which part of the world you showcase. You have to have both physics into different places and switch between them in the real time.
In a previous game dev show, I showed a little demo I was doing where I did exactly that. I had like a multi-world switcher between different things. And what the biggest problem I had wasn't the like shader effect to blend things. It was, what if I'm running along something and I change worlds while standing on something and that thing does or doesn't exist, or something I clip into? I have to now resolve not only the new colliders, but my position relative to the new colliders, and then choose how I want to resolve that per thing. Do I allow the swapping, or do I have to move them out of position? And so that becomes more of a headache than the actual like visual aspect of it.
Yeah.
Most of the time, I see the colliders stay the same. They don't usually change too often.
Yeah, that makes your life a lot easier if they don't. If they don't.
Either that or the collider disappears and you're falling or something. It's
Yeah, but from what I saw in this game, from the gameplays, there is a specific that you have some kind of light that showcases you the second world, and the second world can have some kind of bridge that your sword doesn't have, and then you have to take into account also.
Yeah, but
another example of this too.
Ways to do that, by the way. I just want to point this out very cleanly. So you have two worlds, and you have different collisions for both of them. That lantern, all it has to do is say, "Hey, apply that collider to the other character too." And you're saying that may be difficult if you only have one collider, but the trick is that you have a character collider in both worlds, and you're saying respect the collisions for that world right now, or not respect them, and then everything becomes far easier.
Yeah.
Well, yes and no. So my asterisk to that is, if you look at the background, there's a whole big thing about the physics of Portal. And once you start adding velocities into things, it's no longer as straightforward. And so now you've got the idea, the way that works, if you look at speedrunners, they'll do research into exactly how all of that works. And long story short, there's like a physics bubble around the portal where the entire world uses different rules just around the portal bubble. And then everything else has to be resolved later. It's very, very complicated. Like, it looks seamless, but to make something look seamless. No, it isn't that, no. But it's just to note that, once you start getting into that level, even more complexity, I would never do a Portal game where you can do like physical stuff, because that's just insanity. It would always be stationary changing for me, because it's insane otherwise.
I've done that. I can say without a doubt it's easier than it looks these days. The math has been figured out for many developers who have tackled it. There are PhD papers on that. It's not it's not as complex as it looks.
Yeah, but when you're looking at Unity, you have to think a little more, because you have, if you do something wrong, entire physics system will have to recalculate when you're adding something.
Yeah, but in general, like, when you're using Unity, you have to respect it's not made for that. It's giving you the easiest solution for most game cases, and not the advanced game case you've been thinking of.
Yeah,
and also, like, this is more of a tangent on all of that. Just to broadly keep in mind that think about what's actually impressive or amazing to the user. I always go back to, I think the idea of slopes versus stairs is such a good example of this. It's like, if your game has stairs, you now have to solve for stairs. Any problem stair related is now an issue, which is why a lot of games, the stairs aren't really stairs. They're just like a hidden slope in terms of collider. Or if you're doing like a 2D game, you don't even need slopes at all in some cases. Now, I'm not saying, before we get into the whole thing, I'm not saying that, whatever, that's a design decision. My point is simply to say that in a lot of cases, what'll impress the player is more important than the specifics. In this kind of thing, to me, playing a game and the entire world switches when I press a button, that's insanely impressive, irrespective of if I'm supporting all edge cases of standing on stuff or jumping in midair or launching through the sky. If, like, you can cut out work for yourself if you choose the level of boundary you're willing to accept for complexity. And for a lot of this stuff, I don't think enough games do this as is. I want more games to have like worlds that change as I play them. And if all they're doing is changing the model sets and the characters in them, that's already amazing to me. I don't need anything past that point.
Yeah, the one problem with that is when you're asking for a world to change, you're asking for assets to have state now. And then you have to have the whole state management, and you have to create assets from multiple versions. And you have to include player choice to make sure that the assets that change actually have an impact on the gameplay. And it's not just a randomized thing, because then if you have randomized levels, nobody gives a crap because it's just random. But to have an impact.
You don't always have to, too. When we go back to, I think the original question was kind of about like a World of Warcraft phasing. Like, imagine like the death version of phasing. It's really just some post-processing and making things not attack you anymore, right? When you're like running back to corpses type stuff, you're dead.
But it talked about when you're in a single player game, you progress for quests and then.
Oh yeah, no, totally different. I was saying one of the other ways sometimes this stuff gets set up where there's not actually different stuff in the world. It's really just kind of some post processing and more like the way that the things behave and interact. Like you're phasing and then stuff's no longer able to see you, or different things are able to see and attack you.
Yeah,
and
like
it's really
clips,
more like
camera,
you said, like game objects swapping and some post processing. A lot of the times it's just a single scene like that doing it, and I haven't seen very many games where you can see both worlds at the same time. I feel like this one's kind of an outlier. Usually it's kind of like a switch in between or a switch at loading or something. So yeah, definitely some of the simpler things that I've seen done too.
Well, it's also
go ahead.
I was just gonna another thing too is keep in mind that like without getting into a whole big weird side tangent is the fact that representation is entirely perception based. It's a weird thing to say. Is what I mean is like we can all consume an article, and depending on how our browser is set up or our settings, it can look different. And the same way, like if you've got a world state, you can have each client render it differently how they want to. An example is I worked on one project where there was viewers that could like view into this world, and they had different settings for themselves. So like they could literally choose what models to render for their perceptive view. Because what was actually important on a network side is capsules are being moved around, and whatever things that person wants to render them as is kind of irrelevant to the project. They can say that show them all as gummy bears or show them all as monsters. It's like it's whatever their setting is for like scare mode or something is irrelevant to the like core structure as long as it's not like gameplay relevant. So it is worth noting too, just like we said before with the idea of data and saving. At the end of the day, you're saying there's some state and there's some visual representation of state. It's up to you to decide what those things mean for your project, and it could be as simple as like different renderers or different states, or maybe they're just rendered as flags, or again in some games where you've got like a ghost of a character, all they're doing is querying the position values and then showing a dot in the world on your side relative to that. They're not really like rendering anything more complicated than just gathering the values of those or ghost characters in racing games, right? It's just a lookup for the ghost value. So it depends what you're doing.
Yeah. One more thing that I would say if we're talking about post-processing specifically, though, is there is a lot of value in atmospherics, specifically if you're doing a single-player game and you want to have beats of emotional value. One thing that you would have is a sunny, happy scene, and then the next time you want to have like embers, everything is falling apart, ashes, smoke, etc. The level can be entirely the same. All you care about is turning the color profile way different, adding some VFX so you can see less of it, so you let the imagination fill in for what you cannot see, and then add whatever strong audio or character animation for that specific place where it would say, hey, everything is falling apart. Like if you have a wind system and you're making strong wind in that explicit moment, you're going to create a situation where you start imagining effects that are simply not there. If you have like a particle effect for embers and little pieces of paper, you'll think everything is falling apart, things are getting torn, everything, etc. You don't actually have physics for cloth getting torn or anything. It's just cloth that appears there in the air.
Those particles, it annoys me how it even works on. I get so annoyed when I build a scene and I'm looking at something, and then I just add dust motes in the air, and suddenly everything feels 10 times more volumetric and interesting. And like I'm imagining this stuff, leaves falling off the trees because I can see stuff moving in the wind, and it's like I'm annoyed how much my own brain lies to me because it works. It truly does work.
Yeah, and it's even like it's funnier when you're looking at tree leaf particles in specific. I am playing Wuthering Waves. It's a game that recently released. It has one area that is like full of gigantic toxic mushrooms. If you do the quest line there, the world changes. And what they're doing is they're replacing all the giant mushrooms with glowing trees that have a lot of like pretty leaves falling, and the leaves are glowing as well. And you see it at night, you see a bunch of falling leaves, and you think, oh, this is so beautiful. The leaves aren't falling from anywhere, they're spawning from thin air. But you won't ever notice that one part because you'll think, oh, I didn't see it there. It appeared in the 2 frames that you weren't looking in that specific point because they are glowing now, they weren't glowing before. And if you don't see that, you just think, oh, the leaves are falling all over this area, but they're actually following you. There is a small volume that follows your character in which there are those leaf particles. So
it's always funny when you zoom out on the scene view and you're seeing like a character with like a rain volume. It looks like a joke. Yeah, they're running around with this like rain just over their head.
Works. It really works, and it doesn't even have to follow the character. It has to follow like the camera. The camera is what really matters, and as long as you have a separate system for interaction with the world as opposed to interaction with the view. So, for example, raindrops falling don't actually have to intersect with the floor. What you do instead is you have a wet floor shader, and you have like puddles and what you call it, raindrop animation texture on the water itself. It has nothing to do with the particles. It's just playing on loop.
Sure.
And even in games like Genshin Impact, if you go fly through the sky and you look down on the water as it rains, you'll see the repeat. Like, it's really far because they have like 30 meters of no repeat, but you'll see the repeat if you look at it.
And even like we talked before about things like using billboarding or imposters, it's also amazing how much of that stuff works. Like there was a really old, I'm talking like UDK level tutorial on how to do a rain system in most efficiently as possible. And the trick was really clever to me. It was so dumb. It was a texture of rain falling, and they basically just made an 8x8 grid of this, and they just slapped it on top of the camera. And so it's just basically you had this volumetric rain, just layered textures at different angles. It's obviously like a little bit janky and there's no depth, but like you as a player are not noticing that when you're doing everything else, and it looked really good. Like it looked genuinely really good for what it was.
Especially I did something similar. In my 3D space shooter tutorial, I spawn dust particles around the ship. So, and when you fly, it looks like you're flying through space because stuff is flying by you, but they're only in the local vicinity around the ship. Yeah. Constantly being spawned.
And there is also even more to that when if you push the player to do something within limited time, like there is pressure, you need to get to a point, you can't stay here, whatever the motivation is, as long as you don't let the player actually think and stop, they're not going to notice most of the effects, especially if there is some voice you have to focus on. Like take the attention literally off this thing as it's happening. Just make sure it's all there.
Yeah, and all the other stuff too, like doing FOV changes so it has a feel of tension or change of like scale and stuff. You have to kind of force you to run or drama. There's loads of like things like that.
Yeah, and the best part is once you create those effects, you can use them anywhere. Like you can even
they do see it, they're not going to care.
And like even without joking, like if you created a spawn of dust, you can literally control the velocity of it to make it like, oh, this area is a bit ruined. Oh, this area is in the midst of war. Oh, this area is literally in a giant sandstorm. It's the same effect, different intensities, like very few values changed. Like it's prefab variant with a drop down.
Literally. Yeah, and just one last thing on that too is like this idea of shortcut hacks that kind of have the impression are way more powerful than people think. There's so many scenarios of this. One last one, it's just a dumb one, but it was one of the first little demos I did when I was doing VR, was I wanted to do the Weeping Angels concept from Doctor Who because they're creepy and I want to see them in VR. And so how do you do that? You've got a statue that moves whenever you're not looking at it, all this stuff. But I wanted it to feel creepy. So literally, I had this thing behind you that was just a statue or whatever. And whenever you turned around, I would start a timer and I would literally just have an invisible sound source that would just interpolate to your position over time. And if you ever turned around, I would teleport the thing, the halfway point between the two distances. And so you had this thing that constantly got closer and you can hear it. It's always further away than it sounds, but it always sounds like it's coming towards you, but yet you'll never see it. And you don't have to see the movement. And that was really effective, but it was literally just an invisible sound source and a single teleport code. But it worked, it really worked. So you can cheat a lot of this stuff. You don't have to write anything too complicated. It's all about perception.
Yeah, most stuff in there is cheating. I'm getting flashbacks to all kinds of crazy ideas that I've heard for snow tracking and rain tracking and other stuff.
The one thing that I want to point out here, though, is that I'm talking about how you can reuse these things specifically because if you're working on a single player experience and you want to create progress for the world, a lot of progress is felt the more that you have things to see. It's not just about the plant face that has been placed here now that the character got a home and is now furnishing it. It's a lot more. Like if you are making the environment better, add effects that make the environment feel more lively. If you're making an environment worse, or the story makes the environment more worse, add things that make it feel worse, and you can reuse them. An effect that you constructed for the village storm segment can also be used for the final castle storm segment when you know it's going to be the final battle. And after that, you can just remove the effect, and now you have an entire scene set up for it's like the castle on a sunny day now that the danger has been removed or whatever. It's like the single added effect has doubled the amount of content you have available to work with. 2 scenes for anything.
Yeah.
All right, I've got to go in just a minute, so I wanted to pop over to one job-related topic because I saw this and it made me laugh too much, and I felt like we just had to, I don't know, I had to call it out. There was this report that 21 in 4 people have brought their parents to their interview. It blew me away. I think the thing said 26% of people under the age of 25 had brought their parents to a job interview. I'm curious.
I'm not gonna lie. You'd lose half the marks. You'd be on the back foot to start if you did that. Because like you're not. I'm not hiring your parents. They're not going to be there to help.
I mean, when people say they have a hard time getting a job, if there are any of these people, I can certainly see why, right? But like, has anybody experienced this before? I've luckily never been in a scenario. I've talked to people who've been in this scenario, but I've never actually had somebody that I like interviewed and their parents came in. My mom would never come with me, unfortunately. My kids would know not to ask me.
The one thing I can imagine is if you want them for emotional support outside, and then you go in and you do your thing, and then when you leave, you can like have immediate,
sure. If they're in the car, they drove you there. But this was people like actually in the interview, coming in.
Yeah.
And their parents applied on their behalf.
It wouldn't surprise me if most of these were, the parents were trying to get the kid to get a job and forcing them.
Now, my mom did sort of force me to go apply for a job, but she didn't apply for me, and she certainly didn't come with me to the interview.
So one thing I would say is I'm trying to rationalize for it. A parent figure usually has more connections than you. A circle of influence is a thing that grows as you get older, as you meet more people, as you get more experience in different industries, as you get topics to talk about. People that usually hire you are people who are usually older than you, meaning they have more in common with your parent than with you for the most part, except the proficiency within the job. And sometimes if they don't hire you for the same profession, like a manager that deals more in the social side of things is hiring an engineer, and they don't have an engineer on the staff that's going to qualify your ability to work, then they might have more with the parent figure. That's the only time in which I can say, hey, maybe having a parent who can bring up topics that incite positive emotion has more value. I don't know how I can rationalize this otherwise.
Yeah, no, I can like if you're hiring someone to do contract work that doesn't need to be on site and you're not dealing with them regularly, and I can see a reason why people might that will be fine if they need support for whatever. But the problem is, in most cases, when you're hiring someone for a job that's probably going to be stressful at some degree. And if this telegraphs on the first moment of meeting them that if they cannot stand alone on a stressful situation, I can't support hiring them because I can't rely on them if they need to support the network. Because even if it's not the parent, what you're saying is you're going to need me then later or someone else to come to you. So to me, the telegraphing of saying I need support during stress is far more important and indicative than anything else that would go downstream from that. All jokes aside, like that to me is such a big like you're telegraphing to me that you're going to be more work than help in a lot of cases. Now that might not be true, and I'd still continue the interview and I would talk to them. But what I'm saying is that would backfoot you by half the interview initially before you even start. So I would strongly recommend people don't do this. It's not a good look.
I understand you. There is one thing I want to bring up here is that lately I'm thinking a lot of like managerial success and failure. And if the work is going to get stressful, I would question whether it's rightfully by the nature of the job or because the manager has no capacity to prevent stress from the workers, which is something worth considering.
Oh, sure. But either way, the point is that is the person capable of dealing with things alone, or at least being able to be able to manage things without need? Because the problem that I've had, this again from the managerial side, is if someone has a breakdown, and I'll be honest, I have had worked at things where I've like been at the verge of shouting at people and had to pull someone aside and go, even to my boss, and go, I can't deal with this other person, I need to walk away. It happens. You get into stressful situations. It comes down to how are they going to deal with that. And I worked with one person in particular who had a breakdown in a meeting with a bunch of people and started screaming at like 4 or 5 teammates. Now that's not a them problem anymore. They've now made it an entire team problem, and that causes a lot of issues. So to me,
did he pull out a sword and chop a table in half?
Well, thankfully it's in Zoom.
We need Salim in here because Salim's got some really good.
but like it's one of those things where if if you're telegraphing a low threshold for dealing with situations that you're not comfortable with, that to me is a red flag for that. Because again, if you're a manager, you're looking at like, I have to make sure everyone is okay. There's a whole psychological safety concept and loads of books on the topic. And that's a very, that means that you're a high threat risk for one or the other, and not just like dramatic burst, but also like maybe you'll recoil and you won't be. Another common problem with contractors, especially new people, is they panic and they're unable to fulfill a job they're asked to do, and they just go and hide. They're too afraid to ask for help, but they're also like ashamed that they're not getting the work done, and they don't want to cause harm, but they're sitting there going, I don't know what to do. And so they basically just disappear until someone eventually corners them, and you realize they've gone 3 months without doing the work you've asked them to do. So in either case, it doesn't matter. The point is, somebody who's incapable of dealing with conflict or stress or stuff alone is a huge red flag to me, because they're a problem waiting to happen in one capacity or another.
Yeah, but for me, the biggest problem I'd say is like, if I saw this, I would literally just assume that the kid didn't want the job, or the child, the person that's not the parent didn't want the job. The parent just wants them to get the job, and they're likely to just slack off, do the bare minimum, and try to get fired because they don't.
That's a good point. Yeah, I didn't even think about that too.
That would be like my expectation and my default impression, and unless they will like blew me away with some skills or something, it would be certainly more of a negative than a much bigger negative than a positive that I could see.
Yeah,
there is one more thing that I would say here is that I'm thinking of this the other way around. It might be possible that the parent is like helicoptering for the kid and they wouldn't take no for an answer, which is indicative of bringing baggage to your person on work. But like, if you manage to get a job and the parent wouldn't be coming back, and the person is actually competent and they actually didn't want the parent there, maybe it's something that you could like help.
Yeah, but we're back at the same problem that I said earlier, which is if you cannot deal with conflict, which means you cannot tell your parents to not be in your interview, that's still proving the point. It means you're not going to be conflict.
Well, at 15, I could accept it. The 15-year range. 25, yeah, probably not.
Yeah, it depends though, because like when you are failing a single instance of a skill check, it doesn't indicate how much of the skill you have. It just indicates you failed that one check. You don't know if the person is actually usually highly competent, but this specific other person, the parent, is so difficult that they're literally impossible, like a parasite that wouldn't leave you alone.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
Well, the other part too is like, this is like, it's one of those cascading problems. The other part that I wasn't going to mention, but it's probably worth it, I suppose, is like being an interviewer is a job, and it's a job that requires skill. And a good interviewer has their own job they're doing during the interview, which is they're sussing a person out. They're trying to understand them. And the truth is, a lot of it is leading questions, watching body language, engaging with somebody. If you bring a parental figure to a scenario like that, all of it's gone. I can't rely on your responses or your feedback or the way you communicate or the kinds of humor you use or your body language. Any of this is completely out the window for me to assess what kind of person you are, because you're in a community or in an environment that won't be replicated when we get to the work environment. And so this person you are now is not the person I will be seeing or working with. And so already that's a red flag for me too, because I can't engage with that. If you're a person sitting there, I can start to communicate with you. We can talk, we can find out, and I can find out what your humor is like, how you feel as a person. Obviously, everyone is putting on a show during an interview, but that's the skill of an interviewer to kind of relax that tempo. But if your parents are there, that's not going to happen. You are going to be the person you are in front of your parents, and I cannot engage with that person, and that's going to make it hard for me to figure out whether you're worth hiring, you know?
I guess in that case, I would like be more incentivized to try and remove the parent from the equation, like saying, hey, I'm going to need to interview you and I need to interview you alone. I need to see the
I would absolutely no subtlety. If parents came in and interview like that, I would say, oh, hi, welcome to these are parents, nice to meet you. Oh yeah, we're really looking forward to interview. Anyway, these are one-on-one interviews. There's a lot of NDA stuff. We can't really talk about multiple people. I'm sure you understand. Go away, effectively. And you can diffuse it, make it not their problem. But the fact is, I would not continue the interview with the parents in the room.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. All right. Well, I think I got to wrap stuff up here for the weekend. I guess if anybody's got thoughts or things they want to see for topics next week, drop a comment down below after we're no longer live. You guys have any final thoughts, words, things you want to mention or share?
So Will Goldstone recently had a very positive mention of how he's positive about the future of Unity now that years of degradation are breaking down. I really hope we can see a lot of that, because currently the site is crumbling and a lot of other problems are happening. But there are package changes happening. You can see that Unity is shipping a lot of different versions. We talked about the recent changelog changes, and you can see that a lot is being done to the engine itself. There's like new functionalities, new capabilities, new features, new classes. In future versions of Unity, the forum lists a lot of things that would be pretty nice, like removing the deprecated component accesses that nobody is ever using. Let's just hope that we see a lot of the improvements in Unity has soon, because I really want to be able to talk about those instead of literally anything else about Unity.
Yeah, I hope so, but my cynic brain says that culture is rooted in a company. It's not. It's very easy to kind of have a fantastic. Like, think of how clean it is to have a scapegoat where a person goes, "Thank God that one person's gone. We can now solve all our problems." It worries me when companies are not as transparent with the fact that, you know.
You just gotta kill the witch story.
Yeah,
if you find all the witches and burn them, everything will get better.
Yeah, it's basically whenever one person is ousted from something and then everything is supposedly better, that to me is almost worse as a thing, because it's an indication that it's like there's a good scapegoating going on. I'm not happy with that. Again, the one of the comments in the thread was like, let's see how this fares, or let's see how this history is kind of like, sure. So I'm willing to give it a go. I'm not going to buy the the commentary that, you know, that one evil person is the problem for everything, because that's not how life works. People all buy into things and stuff sort of happens, you know.
Okay. So,
well, let's be optimistic. Hopefully things go great. And next week we'll have to talk about Unite. Totally forgot about that. I miss Andrew too, but Andrew is off sending us pictures of his beautiful vacation.
Ugh,
yes, he's seeing pictures of him and nice beaches and other stuff. His actual background looks like mine. But all right, yeah, it was good seeing y'all. Anything else? I think I already asked that.
One thing that's
right. Monday.
Coming on Monday.
That's
you
right.
should look on Asset Store and Nature Manufacturer, Twitter, and social media.
And there's a link right there. Go check it out. It's RAM 3, right? Not RAM 2023?
Yeah, it's RAM 3.
All right. Well, yeah, definitely go check that out. And then we'll be back here next week if you want to go spy on Story and Yorai's Discord conversation some more too. There's the link to hop on in. And other than that, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment down below. Let us know what you want us to talk about next week. And I guess we'll see you all then. All right. Thanks.